When you sit down for a classic sci-fi epic, you expect massive space armadas and laser fire, but Dune decides to slam the brakes. Instead of an intergalactic dogfight, the story opens in a dark, quiet, dimly lit room. Inside that room, an old woman forces a young boy to put his hand into a small box. She tells him that if he pulls his hand out to escape the agony building inside it, she will kill him instantly with a poison needle. This intimate standoff is the ultimate hook. The psychological stakes established in this single room are higher and more immediate than any galactic space battle. The boy is Paul Atreides, a royal heir who is completely untested and stepping into a massive shadow of destiny. The box teaches him the foundational rule of survival in this universe. Brute force is irrelevant. Every conversation carries hidden meaning, and every action has lethal consequences. Frank Herbert built this world on intense emotional and political tension, rather than pure technology. He wanted to show that the real danger in the galaxy isn't found in machines, but in people. The Reverend Mother's test is a localized version of a much larger threat. The pain in the box is a mirror for the macroscopic danger closing in on Paul from every corner of the galaxy. To understand why Paul is being tested, we have to look past the palace walls, at his family's new destination, the desert planet Arrakis. This diagram shows the economic linchpin, the spice melange. Required for space travel, Arrakis is the most valuable territory. Notice these data points representing extreme environments. Surviving Arrakis requires absolute discipline. Controlling spice controls the universe, but the ecosystem kills. There is no water, only heat and giant sandworms. On Arrakis, a single mistake in judgment isn't just a failure, it's a death sentence. Whoever is awarded control of the planet gains infinite wealth, but they also inherit an environment that demands perfection just to see the next sunrise. This pincer movement illustrates the trap set for Paul's family. Arrakis is the bait, used to lure House Atreides into a position where their enemies can crush them. Being given this planet looks like a royal promotion, but in reality, it is a carefully disguised execution order from the Emperor himself. Paul is entering a world of changing realities. Assassination attempts hide behind formal manners, and enemies smile while reaching for their blades. To stay alive, he must rely on acute observation. He has to see the hidden threat in every polite bow and every official decree. Political survival on Arrakis requires treating every single interaction, no matter how mundane, as a potential threat to his life. This brings us back to the visceral pain of the test. Paul is enduring the sensation of his flesh being burned away while the Reverend Mother watches. The Reverend Mother is using a philosophical and religious crucible to determine if Paul is actually human or merely a high-functioning animal. Herbert's concept is simple. A base animal instinctively flees pain. A human intellect must override that biological reflex and remain in the fire. Surviving the box proves Paul possesses the maturity required to handle the pressure of his future. In this universe, the capacity for leadership begins with the total, disciplined conquest of personal fear. Paul survives. When he pulls his hand from the box, it is unharmed, but his psychological baseline has permanently shifted. These three pillars, observation, physical discipline, and the mastery of fear, now form the foundation of his identity. Through this ordeal, Paul has shed his innocence. He has taken his first functional steps as a survivor who can see the world as it truly is. This growth wasn't a choice, but a forced adaptation. He must evolve quickly to survive the political and ecological realities closing in on him. This focus on the internal human struggle is what makes Dune unique among all science fiction works. As you see in this model, Herbert believed that ecology, politics, and religion are not separate forces. They rotate together to form one inseparable system that dictates the fate of billions. The microscopic test of the box is the entire universe in miniature. It is a world where suffering is inevitable, and only those who can master themselves can hope to navigate it. In a universe defined by lethal empires and unforgiving planets, a spaceship or a laser is secondary. The ultimate weapon is a thoroughly trained, disciplined human mind. Imagine living your entire life on a serene, water-rich planet. surrounded by oceans and gentle rains, only to be told you have to abandon it completely. For House Atreides on the planet Caladan, centuries of peaceful stability are violently interrupted by an imperial decree. This relocation requires uprooting their entire civilization. House Atreides is moving their military, their administration, and their complete planetary power structure across the galaxy. Their destination is the desert planet Arrakis. It is the harshest environment known to humanity, and paradoxically, the most heavily contested and strictly monitored rock in the universe. This forced migration is a carefully engineered geopolitical hazard. House Atreides is marching directly into the crosshairs of rival factions. Arrakis dictates galactic affairs for one single reason. It is the exclusive source of the spice melange. This diagram shows how the entire galactic economy operates. Notice how all the vast trade lines and transit routes funnel into a single point. Without the spice melange, interstellar travel stops entirely, and the galactic economy collapses. On paper, handing a single family a monopoly over the universe's most valuable resource looks like an incredible prize. In practice, the intense political jealousy and extreme danger that come with it create a lethal target on their backs. The prestigious promotion to rule Arrakis is a carefully constructed death trap, disguised as a royal gift. For young Paul Atreides, the heir to the house, this impending departure instantly rewrites the rules of his daily life. Casual conversations are gone. He now operates in an environment where every dialogue carries a hidden meaning, layered with subtext and potential threats. The stakes are suddenly enormous. A misplaced word, a slight hesitation, or a minor action can ripple outwards, triggering immediate political consequences. To navigate this, Paul starts to mature through strict observation. He trains himself to read the tension in a room, to notice what isn't being said, and to decode the silent motives of the adults around him. In this cutthroat landscape, missing a social cue or misinterpreting a gesture will cost him his life. Beyond the political maneuvering, there is the raw physical reality of Arrakis itself. It is an aggressively lethal desert environment that violently rejects the water-accustomed biology of the Atreides. They are trading temperate climates and abundant oceans for an alien world that bleeds moisture from the body. Basic biology, not politics, dictates who lives and who dies. Surviving this transition demands a total overhaul of the mind and body. Paul and his entire house must submit to an intense, rigorous discipline, learning to conserve every drop of water and every ounce of energy. On Arrakis, this level of discipline is the absolute biological requirement for staying alive. It is the only way to endure a world that offers no margin for error. As the physical and political threats mount, a heavier, abstract pressure begins to close in on Paul. He is entangled in centuries-old religious prophecies, deep philosophical questions, and a crushing weight of destiny. A palpable atmosphere of doom settles over the narrative, forcing the young heir to confront profound existential dread about what his life is meant to become. Processing this specific terror, the fear of his own vast potential and the violent path ahead, is the final stage of his psychological crucible. He has to let the terror wash over him and pass through him, experiencing it fully without letting it freeze his mind or cloud his judgment. Mastering that internal panic is the psychological threshold that strips away a vulnerable boy and leaves behind a formidable leader. By the time the ships are packed, Paul's childhood is effectively dead. The mere preparation to leave Caladan has forced him to grow up. Through the relentless internal trials of observation, strict physical discipline, and the confrontation of his own fear, Paul has taken his first definitive steps toward leadership. We zoom out from the narrative to see the deliberate intent of the author, Frank Herbert. He meticulously stacked these pressures to forge his protagonist. This initial pivot from the waters of Caladan to the sands of Arrakis contains all the machinery that makes the story work. Herbert managed to take complex disciplines like philosophy, religion, ecology, and the mechanics of leadership and weave them into one tight, cohesive story. The result is a narrative where a choice in a drawing room can change the climate of a planet, and an ecological shift can topple an empire, a level of multidimensional depth that has kept the story relevant for decades.
In the vastness of the known universe, the ultimate focal point of power is a desolate, waterless rock. Arrakis is the most fiercely contested planet in existence. This network diagram illustrates exactly why. Every major galactic faction and interstellar guild connects directly back to this single central hub, Arrakis. The resource that flows outward is the spice melange. Interstellar travel and the entire galactic economy rely entirely on this one substance, giving whoever controls Arrakis an absolute monopoly. Duke Leto Atreides looks at the imperial decree granting him Arrakis and recognizes the underlying hostility. He understands that this position is an invitation to his own destruction. By placing the Atreides in charge of the galaxy's spice supply, the Emperor has effectively isolated the family within a global target range. The economic opportunity serves as the bait for a meticulously designed death sentence. This creates an immediate problem. How does a leadership structure prepare to survive a lethal snare they are knowingly walking into? Duke Leto understands that outlasting his enemies requires a total shift in perspective. They cannot view Arrakis as mere geography. They have to treat the planet itself as a hostile, living political entity. The searing heat and massive sandworms of the desert are obvious physical threats, but the immediate suffocating danger actually lies indoors, within the political court of Arrakis itself. This logic model maps the brutal rule of dialogue in this arena. The top track shows a polite, surface statement, but the absolute emotional tension of the court forces a parallel track of hidden intent underneath. Every casual conversation carries secondary threats and carefully veiled power plays. The consequences don't stop at conversation. If we watch this model expand, a minor administrative choice branches outward into a cascading web of volatile political reactions. Moving a guard post or changing a shipping schedule instantly threatens an unseen rival. Navigating this environment exacts an exhausting psychological toll. The characters are forced to constantly recalculate their alliances and make high-stakes decisions while the reality around them shifts by the hour. The true mechanism of the Arrakis trap relies on this continuous friction. Enemies here prefer to drown a rival in paranoia and severe decision fatigue. Standard military tactics and brute force fail against a trap built on weaponized information. Paul Atreides realizes that traditional strength cannot counter an enemy that attacks through psychological fatigue and social subversion. Paul begins his strategic response with his first tool, acute, hyper-vigilant observation. He watches the smallest gestures and micro-expressions of his adversaries to decode their true motives. He pairs this observation with rigid mental and physical discipline. By locking down his own reactions, he ensures his enemies have zero emotional leverage to exploit. But his most critical tool is his deliberate processing of extreme fear. Rather than panicking, he lets the terror pass through him, analyzing it and crystallizing it into a solid, controllable state of focus. The unrelenting pressure of Arrakis forces Paul to abandon his naivete. Instead of breaking under the strain, he adopts the cold, predictive logic necessary to outmaneuver those who set the trap. The Atreides family's struggle on Arrakis provides a blueprint for the broader mechanics of power, survival, and destiny in the universe of Dune. Surviving this environment demands the integration of disciplines that are almost always kept entirely separate in standard science fiction. This Venn diagram maps out those necessary fields. We have philosophy, religion, and planetary ecology. True leadership doesn't emerge from mastering just one of these circles. It exists entirely in the central intersection, where all three disciplines overlap and inform one another. Author Frank Herbert meticulously wove these complex systems together. He designed an atmosphere heavy with emotional tension and political danger, elevating the story far beyond standard genre conventions. The novel remains distinct because it demonstrates a harsh reality. Mastering a hostile universe requires an interconnected understanding of human nature and ecology, rather than a reliance on advanced technology.
Imagine a galactic empire spanning thousands of star systems, built entirely on a single point of failure. Remove one resource, and the structure collapses inward. This vital resource is the spice melange. It is the singular most valuable substance in existence, required for the very functions that keep the empire alive. This chart illustrates the macroeconomy of the empire. Spice sits squarely in the center, its continuous flow dictating the balance of power, feeding every major political faction across the stars. But look at the fragility of this system. If you disrupt that central hub, outward supply lines sever. Without spice, interstellar travel stops, economies freeze, and the power structure fails. And you can only find this indispensable resource on one singular, deeply hostile desert planet, Arrakis. Enter Paul Atreides. He's a young noble who has just been thrust directly into the geographic center of this deadly cosmic crosshairs. When one planet holds the entire galaxy's fuel supply, the great houses don't just watch from afar, they position themselves to seize it by any means necessary. For the Atreides, arriving on Arrakis means entering a territory where their every rival is already waiting to strike. Because whoever controls the spice controls the universe. Paul's new home functions as both the source of absolute authority and the most lethal environment he will ever face. The physical hazards of the desert are constant, but they are easily matched by the unseen dangers inside the claustrophobic, politically charged halls of Arrakis's high society. Out here, power is not measured by the size of your army or your brute military strength. Wars are won and lost through calculated, quiet political maneuvering. To survive in this environment, you have to understand the core rule of engagement. No one says exactly what they mean. Every single conversation carries a layered, hidden subtext. This visualization tracks how influence operates. A minor social gesture, a misplaced word or skipped meeting, destabilizes a dozen alliances simultaneously. Zooming into that initial action reveals intricate sub-connections, creating constant emotional tension for characters who must scrutinize every microscopic cue to survive. Traditional combat tactics are useless here. To keep his family breathing, Paul has to master a completely invisible psychological battlefield. Navigating these rapidly shifting political realities requires a highly specific mental framework. Paul cannot react on instinct. He has to actively rewire his own mindset. The first stage of his adaptation is strict observation. He has to watch his surroundings and his peers with severe, calculated precision, gathering data before making a single move. The second stage is intense internal discipline. While he reads others, he has to lock down his own emotional responses to prevent revealing any of his hidden motives. The third and most crucial is the active management of his own fear. He doesn't simply eliminate it, he masters it entirely, allowing it to pass completely through him without dictating his actions. This forces a truly unique coming-of-age story. Paul's growth is purely psychological, a rapid ascent into the hyper-vigilant maturity required to avoid getting caught in a lethal political web. To understand why this story feels distinct from typical science fiction, we must look past Paul's personal struggle and examine the broader intellectual intent of his creator, author Frank Herbert. Herbert is arguing a specific thesis here. True power and effective leadership do not exist in a vacuum. They are deeply intersectional. Herbert constructs his world by weaving together four distinct disciplines most writers keep separate: politics, religion, ecology, and philosophy. Paul realizes he cannot view these fields in isolation. You can't understand desert ecology without religious fervor or political greed. At their intersecting center is spice. Paul's ability to synthesize these four domains into a single, cohesive worldview allows him to see paths that his enemies miss. It forges him into a highly observant, multidisciplinary protagonist. That is why the story endures. It provides a model for navigating complex systems, demonstrating that surviving, and ultimately leading, requires mastering the exact point where resources, environment, and human culture collide. House Atreides is packing up their entire civilization. They are leaving their lush home planet of Caladan to relocate to a new world. This move carries the heavy branding of a massive political promotion, sanctioned by the Emperor himself. Yet, observing the final hours on Caladan reveals a mood far removed from a celebration. The air is thick with ambition and deep, quiet dread. Duke Leto and his advisors recognize this relocation as a lethal orchestration by their oldest rivals, the Harkonnens. They are choosing to step into this position while knowing their enemies have spent years preparing the ground for their arrival. Loading these ships is a march into a political crossfire where their survival depends entirely on anticipating a betrayal they cannot yet see. The center of this political gravity is the desert planet Arrakis. Arrakis is a barren wasteland, but it maintains an absolute monopoly on a single resource. It is the only known source of the spice melange. Look at this map of the galactic economy. Every illuminated trade route, every shipping guild, and every major power relies on the spice. It is the fuel for interstellar travel and the key to extending human life, making it the most valuable substance discovered. This creates a rigid geopolitical rule for this universe. The faction that holds Arrakis and controls the flow of the spice holds the entire galaxy by the throat. Because the stakes involve absolute economic control, taking the governorship of this planet is a visible target. The infinite wealth of the spice makes this royal appointment function more like a death sentence. That high-level political danger bleeds down into daily life, manifesting as a pervasive, suffocating paranoia. The physical reality of Arrakis, a desert that can kill an unprotected human in hours, casts a psychological shadow over the Atreides household long before they reach the sand. It alters every interpersonal exchange. A simple greeting or a glance across a table now carries layers of hidden intent, where missing a subtle cue could lead to a lethal mistake. In this state of hypervigilance, no action remains neutral. Whether it is a choice of diet or a change in staff, every decision ripples with severe political consequences. The characters must constantly scan their environment, adapting to sudden betrayals and making agonizing moral choices just to see the next sunrise. The tension is so tightly wound that a quiet conversation in a locked room carries the same weight as an all-out military assault. At the center of this pressure is the young heir, Paul Atreides. The hostile reality accelerating around him forces him to rapidly shed the comforts of his childhood. To navigate this environment, Paul develops a rigid internal architecture. He relies on intense personal discipline and hyper-observation, absorbing every microscopic detail of the threats circling his family. Rather than letting the dread paralyze him, Paul uses his own fear as an internal compass, a precise instrument for navigating the political minefield. His rapid maturation is a high-speed evolutionary response, forced upon him by a political landscape that leaves no room for slow growth. The architect behind this tension is author Frank Herbert. He meticulously weaves together emotional vulnerability with political danger to trap his characters in a situation that feels claustrophobic, despite the scale of the setting. This diagram illustrates what sets the novel apart. Herbert builds his world on 4 interlocking pillars: philosophy, religion, ecology, and leadership. Notice how these systems interact. The brutal ecological reality of the desert dictates the religious and philosophical beliefs of the people living there. True power in Dune centers on the intellectual mastery of these intersecting systems, placing knowledge and foresight above the raw numbers of a military force. By the time the physical packing is complete, the Atreides family has already evolved into a hardened political unit before a single ship even launches. The extreme pressure has stripped away their innocence. They have transitioned from passive political pawns waiting for orders into hyper-alert, active survivors. These final days of arrival preparation test whether they possess the required ruthlessness to exist on Arrakis. This atmosphere of dread and disciplined preparation serves as the ignition point for the events that will soon define Paul Atreides' future.
When House Atreides arrives on Arrakis to take command, they project an aura of absolute nobility and strength. They march their troops and plant their banners, radiating the confidence of an established imperial power. The center of this transition is the spice melange. Securing Arrakis means controlling the most valuable substance in the known universe, turning a barren wasteland into a source of immense wealth. Frank Herbert built the world of Dune through the lens of political strategy and environmental symbolism, creating a setting where every event tests the limits of power. Beneath that outward display of military might and regal authority lies a precarious reality. In this universe, even the most entrenched power can shatter when faced with the right combination of pressure and betrayal. The Atreides have stepped into a political vacuum. Arrakis is a hostile environment governed entirely by the harsh requirements of ambition and survival. Waiting in the shadows is Baron Harkonnen. Long before the Atreides landed on the sand, he had already set a complex, invisible conspiracy into motion. The wealth of the spice trade serves as the trigger for a lethal trap, prearranged by those who want the Atreides family destroyed. Baron Harkonnen acts as the architect of the family's ruin, drafting a political strategy aimed at their total destruction. He targets the human element, weaponizing the very traits the Atreides pride themselves on. He turns their loyalty, responsibility, and hidden fears into tools for their own downfall. The conspiracy operates as a web of hidden threats. Agents maneuver quietly, cutting communication lines and isolating the Atreides from external support systems. His embedded agents use subtle symbolism to coordinate moves in plain sight, ensuring the trap springs without alerting the guards. By exploiting the systemic fragility of a noble house, the Baron dismantles one of the most powerful families in the Empire, piece by piece. At the center of this collapsing political structure is the young heir, Paul Atreides. Curious, leaning in, Paul uses the shock of the unfolding betrayal as a catalyst. Instead of retreating, he experiences a period of rapid intellectual growth, fueled by the surrounding emotional conflict. He steps back and observes. He actively studies the tactics of his mentors and the deceptions of hidden enemies, absorbing the realities of leadership in a dangerous universe. This internal evolution mirrors the external pressures of Arrakis. The environment forces him to look past the financial value of the spice and engage directly with the planet's cultural complexity. The trap succeeds in shattering the house, but it fails to destroy the heir. It strips away his political naivety, leaving behind a student of survival. In the aftermath of the conspiracy, the power dynamic lies in ruins. The destruction demonstrates no leader is safe from the reach of ambition. Yet the Harkonnen plot triggers an unintended consequence. The absolute devastation of his home forces Paul to undergo a radical adaptation. A new rule of survival takes hold. Traditional military power is secondary to mastering environmental symbolism and cultural adaptation. We see this in Paul's transformation. He moves away from his identity as a formal noble heir and emerges as a weathered, desert-forged survivor. The intersection of environmental danger and political betrayal drives the narrative forward. These pressures force Paul to navigate themes of destiny and loyalty while adapting to a planet that kills the unprepared. The Harkonnen conspiracy inadvertently creates the conditions for Paul's rise. By stripping away his safety, the Baron forces his enemy to become a student of survival and a leader capable of upending the imperial order. In a universe driven by ambition, even the most established political power can be shattered in an instant. The logic of this universe is ruthless. It is a place where hidden threats and quiet betrayals can undo the strongest leaders before they even realize a move has been made against them. House Atreides has spent generations on the planet Caladan. There, they operate within a framework of known, stable rules, governing a world they have mastered completely. When power is this stable for this long, it begins to feel like a law of nature. The Atreides have lived under the same skies and the same laws for so long that the very idea of a world without those protections has become unthinkable. On Caladan, safety is physical. It's built into the dark oceans and the fortified cliffs, a world where the environment itself acts as a shield. This security is traded away by imperial decree.
The Emperor's mandate forces House Atreides to leave their ancestral home to take command of the desert planet, Arrakis. By leaving Caladan, the Atreides lose more than just a home. The tactical maneuvers, their political alliances, and defensive strategies that kept them safe for centuries are suddenly invalidated. This is the strategic reality of the move. When a political entity is pulled from a closed, predictable system and dropped into an unknown one, their established structures become disorganized and exposed. To arrive on Arrakis is to face a hostile reality. It is a world of shifting sands, capable of erasing any trace of human presence. This wasteland produces the spice melange, the most valuable substance in existence and the fuel for the entire interstellar economy. Spice flows from a single tiny point, Arrakis, to every sector, making it the universe's economic linchpin. But that wealth brings a cost. Outward lines reverse, drawing rival aggression back in, creating a constant siege. On Arrakis, possessing the ultimate prize means living under an ultimate, permanent threat. The leaders of House Atreides feel this pressure immediately. They have moved from a world of certainty to one where every shadow represents a new variable they haven't accounted for. We see them struggling to reconcile their duty to the Emperor with the visceral fear of an environment they cannot control. Governance becomes an exercise in survival. Every meeting is a defensive maneuver, searching for hidden enemies in a place with no roots. These leaders are reacting to Arrakis using the tools of Caladan. They are trying to force a new, chaotic reality to fit into their old, orderly boxes. Paul Atreides takes a different approach. While his elders react with fear, Paul watches with a quiet, analytical curiosity. He begins to see the flaws in the traditional survival tactics being used around him. He notices that the old ways of holding power are failing in this new heat. Paul immerses himself in the complexity of the desert, learning to read the environment and its culture as a set of symbols rather than just a set of dangers. While the adults try to survive by resisting the change, Paul survives by letting the change reshape him. The journey to Arrakis is a one-way trip, not just in distance, but in identity. The old paradigm of safety has been incinerated. Like a leaf in the desert, the comforts of Caladan have been reduced to ash. The authority the Atreides wielded on Caladan was tied to its oceans and its history. In the sands of Arrakis, that authority evaporates, leaving them with a form of power that no longer fits the lock. Paul's focus on the mechanics of his new world, rather than the memory of his old one, redefines the requirements of leadership. Leadership isn't a set of static rules, it's a capacity for adaptation. It cannot be truly tested in a place where the outcome is already known. In a universe defined by ambition and betrayal, the entity that adapts fastest to a deadly transition is the one that will ultimately control the future. When House Atreides breaks atmosphere and descends onto the desert surface of Arrakis, they arrive to take control of the galaxy's most coveted resource. In this universe, the prevailing logic seems simple. Secure the spice melange, and you secure total economic dominance and a decisive victory over your rivals. But taking Arrakis does not solidify an empire's security. The planet is a systemic trap engineered to bleed its occupiers dry. Because the spice is entirely singular in its value, it creates a massive political vacuum. The sheer scale of the profit attracts predators, drawing rival factions and hidden assassins out of the shadows to claim a piece of the wealth. To survive this environment, the Atreides have to perform an exhausting high-wire act. They're forced to demand unwavering loyalty from their ranks, while actively managing the constant, suffocating fear of an unseen knife in the dark. Securing the ultimate prize offers no protection. It simply paints a target on the victor's back and guarantees a struggle for survival. That fight plays out directly on the ground, against an ecosystem that actively rejects human life. The deep desert operates by its own lethal logic. A faction cannot bomb it into submission or conquer it with legions of troops. Survival requires observing its patterns and bending to its rules. While the sand threatens to bury them, the political realities of the spice trade threaten to tear them apart from the inside. The promise of infinite wealth creates a Machiavellian landscape where betrayal is a daily certainty. These two forces act like a vice: environmental hostility on one side and political betrayal on the other exert crushing pressure on House Atreides. With the structure buckling, leadership must constantly reevaluate security measures to stave off total collapse. Conquering Dune demands an exhausting, endless war of attrition, waged simultaneously against the planet's ecology and human greed. Right in the center of this conflict is the young heir, Paul Atreides, and instead of leading the charge, he's quietly watching. He studies the seasoned commanders around him, observing how they make life or death decisions when a single logistical error means a whole battalion dies of thirst. He tracks the subtle shifts in the local culture and decodes the hidden maneuvers of enemies who have already infiltrated the highest levels of their government. In these tense council rooms, he realizes that a carefully placed word or an assassination attempt hidden in subtext can cut just as deep as a poisoned blade. Trying to anticipate every lethal variable in a system designed to kill him pushes his mental capacity to the breaking point. This constant exposure to deception and survival tactics forces a rapid intellectual evolution. The unforgiving nature of Arrakis acts as a forge. The omnipresent danger provides the exact pressure required to sharpen Paul into a leader who can see the traps before they spring. The reality of Arrakis forces House Atreides to shed their traditional noble protocols in favor of a lean, survivalist hierarchy. The desert strips away a fatal galactic illusion: the idea that hoarding resources and accumulating vast wealth will somehow buy a faction's safety. This entire ecosystem of danger was designed by author Frank Herbert, who used the harsh environmental realities of Dune to encode a deeper warning. He shows us that in a universe driven by ruthless ambition, a title or a royal birthright guarantees nothing. To actually survive, a leader has to study their environment, internalize its rules, and adapt to it physically and emotionally, rather than foolishly demanding the planet yield to them. The trap set on Arrakis proves that inherited power is inherently fragile. The only way to harden that power is to evolve to meet the brutal demands of the desert, a test that Paul Atreides is forced to pass. Welcome to Arrakis. This planet generates the most lucrative economy in the known universe, yet its surface remains a vacuum completely devoid of safety. This chart tracks the flow of the spice melange. While the central node accumulates staggering wealth, that very accumulation creates these incoming threat vectors. Controlling the spice places a massive target on a leader's back. Paul Atreides' exploration of Arrakis goes beyond a standard diplomatic tour. He is stepping directly into a meticulously designed trap. To survive, Paul must immediately begin decoding a universe ruled entirely by the cold mechanics of ambition and survival. The possession of the galaxy's most powerful asset is the specific mechanism that makes Atreides' political power so fragile. The physical hostility here is absolute. Blistering desert winds and water scarcity mean that even simple existence requires constant vigilance. This inescapable danger breeds a unique planetary culture. Every custom and tool is engineered strictly for perpetual survival. The environment serves as a physical mirror for the narrative. The deadly, unpredictable desert reflects the treacherous landscape of the city's politics. On Arrakis, the planet itself acts as an active, hidden enemy, one that cannot be defeated by standard military force. Inside the city walls, the focus shifts to the internal political landscape. Paul watches closely as powerful leaders negotiate their positions. Frank Herbert builds the tension of this world through careful, calculated dialogue, rather than relying on action sequences. In this city, every conversation is a strategic maneuver. The cultural complexity means that a polite exchange is often laced with the threat of betrayal. Unseen enemies plotting from within the ranks pose a more immediate threat to House Atreides than a direct frontal assault on their shields. Political survival in Arrakis requires Paul to treat every interaction as a potentially lethal encounter. Living within this systemic fragility takes a heavy emotional toll on every character in the capital. Analytical. This diagram maps the psychological pressure of Arrakis.
As the fear axis spikes, it violently distorts the character's sense of loyalty and responsibility. Survival requires balancing these three conflicting forces under constant pressure. Leadership carries the crushing burden of protecting an entire people from threats that remain unknown and ever-present. This intense emotional crucible is the specific mechanism that either shatters a person's resolve or forces them to immediately evolve. Paul Atreides is no longer a passive observer. He has begun to move with a new sense of purpose through this dangerous world. His exposure to the fragility of Arrakeen triggered a period of rapid intellectual and emotional growth. He realizes that he cannot fight the hostile system head-on. To survive destiny and betrayal, he must begin to adapt to the planet's existing rules. This monolithic structure represents traditional power. When it encounters Arrakis, it shatters. Brute force breaks under this environment. Note how the pieces are reforming. Paul observes that an adaptive network absorbs pressure that would otherwise destroy a rigid system. Paul's exploration of Arrakeen reveals a central truth of the narrative. A leader must understand why power is fragile before they can hope to wield it.
To understand Arrakis, you have to look past the endless dunes and blistering heat. This desert is the undisputed economic center of the universe. Every ounce of wealth, every ounce of leverage, flows from a single source, the spice melange. Because the spice extends life and makes interstellar travel possible, whoever controls it commands the galaxy. That absolute monopoly breeds a specific kind of predator, filling the planet with factions driven by extreme, ruthless ambition. This is the exact dynamic author Frank Herbert designed for this universe. He built a system where ambition dictates survival, and where power, no matter how entrenched it seems, remains incredibly fragile. Which brings us to a dinner party. The Atreides formal banquet initially presents itself as a highly civilized gathering. Fine clothing, rich food, and the elite members of society mingling under one roof. But the polite etiquette is a thin mask. Beneath the clinking glasses, this room is a political powder keg. Everyone invited represents a competing faction, harboring deeply hidden agendas and unspoken rivalries. So how do you survive a dinner where every guest wants you dead, and a misplaced word is just as lethal as a blade in the dark? Looking at this map of the banquet table's physical layout, we can see the invisible boundaries at play. The seating arrangements and intersecting lines of sight are deliberately designed to reflect the deep-seated conflicts and allegiances of the guests. Each person sitting here is running a complex internal calculus. They are attempting to project flawless outward etiquette while actively managing an intense fear of assassination or political ruin. The weight on these guests is immense. They balance competing loyalties to their respective houses and guilds, constantly scanning the room for unknown threats that could materialize at any moment. To navigate this minefield, the characters engage in what Herbert crafts as careful dialogue. Every sentence carries a dual meaning. They use this conversation to probe for weaknesses, launch subtle attacks, and mount invisible defenses. The complex culture of Arrakis serves as a hidden blade. No one in this room says exactly what they mean. Surviving this environment means interpreting those cultural layers as they happen. Missing a single conversational cue or misinterpreting a glance equates to a fatal political error. Down at the end of the table sits young Paul Atreides. While the macro-politics rage across the dining room, Paul focuses on the micro-interactions happening right in front of him. On the outside, he looks like a passive, quiet teenager sitting through a formal dinner. Internally, he is breaking down every gesture and inflection in the room. He analyzes the micro-expressions and word choices of the powerful leaders around him. One by one, he strips away their carefully constructed diplomatic masks to isolate their actual motives. Through this intense observation, Paul maps out the immediate threats. He successfully identifies the enemies hiding in plain sight among the guests, pinpointing exactly who poses a danger to his family. His tutor's abstract lessons are replaced by the visceral reality of Arakan politics. Processing these threats, his mind recalibrates to match the danger. Paul realizes that his survival on this planet will not depend on physical combat or military strength. The ability to parse the room is the only weapon that actually matters here. This dinner sequence acts as the definitive moment of adaptation for Paul and the Atreides family. It forces an immediate evolution in how they operate. The vague, abstract dangers of Arrakis suddenly take physical shape. Through the subtle betrayals and environmental symbolism served at the table, the family finally sees the exact dimensions of the trap they've walked into. This single dining room becomes the point where Herbert's themes of destiny and leadership physically collide. The abstract concept of ruling a planet is reduced to the brutal reality of outsmarting the person sitting across from you. It reveals a central truth about Herbert's universe. The most consequential and dangerous battles are rarely fought in the open desert with standing armies. True power belongs to those who can master the lethal, unspoken rules of political strategy. Wars are won and lost in these quiet, highly formal moments of social conflict. The banquet acts as a crucible. It proves that true leadership requires the ability to survive the deadly architecture of human ambition, rather than merely holding a title of authority. The desert planet of Arrakis is a world of harsh extremes and lethal beauty. When House Atreides arrives to take control of the spice trade, they are stepping into a landscape defined by ancient prophecies and high-level political volatility. Their survival strategy centers on defending against external threats, massive orbital bombardments, or the crushing natural power of the open desert. The true existential danger to the Atreides bloodline remains hidden within the household itself, completely invisible to their military scanners. That threat resides within the mind of a single, deeply trusted physician, Dr. Wellington Yue. Yue has undergone strict imperial conditioning, designed to make it physically impossible for him to betray his employers. But the rival Harkonnens have bypassed this mental lock. They have weaponized his personal grief, using emotional leverage to slowly fracture his psyche. A sprawling political empire is about to be toppled, and catalyst is a single compromised human mind. The author, Frank Herbert, built his universe on a deliberate foundation. He refused to rely on simple, flat antagonists. U.S. internal conflict acts as a central anchor for the narrative. Herbert gives every figure in this story very tangible human strengths and crippling weaknesses. He tests his characters using 4 primary psychological pressures: fear, loyalty, ambition, and the raw instinct for survival. As these forces overlap and compress, they strip away the character's external defenses. By exposing this raw human frailty, the distant alien conflicts of Arrakis feel grounded and emotionally meaningful to the reader. These intense environmental and political pressures are acting on everyone, sending shockwaves through the entire Atreides ranks. We see this most clearly by tracking the intellectual evolution of Paul Atreides. He is actively processing the harsh realities of absolute power, the heavy expectations of prophecy, and the responsibilities tied to leadership. This period of extreme instability breaks Ye, but it forces Paul to rapidly integrate his training to survive. Extreme pressure acts as a universal sorting mechanism in Herbert's world. It shatters the compromised and hardens the resilient. These human struggles play out against the constant looming presence of Arrakis, a permanent reminder of nature's overwhelming power. On Arrakis, a single mistake with a stillsuit is as fatal as a misplaced word in the imperial court, where the need for survival dictates every alliance. Ultimately, this narrative examines how fragile family bonds and interpersonal trust can become, and the necessity of personal sacrifice when those bonds fail. It is this specific fusion, Ye's trauma, Paul's evolution, and the punishing physical environment that gives the story its enduring weight. By grounding these intergalactic conflicts in basic human impulses, fear, loyalty, and the price of trust, Herbert ensures the story remains relevant long after the technology it describes has faded.
Arrakis is a world of absolute extremes. These collapsing and shifting dunes define a landscape that exerts a deadly, overwhelming power over every living thing. For the humans attempting to survive here, every breath is a calculated risk within a volatile and unforgiving ecosystem. Because the environment is so hostile, survival becomes a matter of social mechanics, depending entirely on the strength of family bonds and the rigidity of trust. This creates a pressure cooker where human vulnerability and political tensions are squeezed until they reach a breaking point. Paul Atreides experiences a sudden internal rupture. His vision pulses with a golden hue as he sees things that haven't happened yet. While dreams usually fade upon waking, these images persist as concrete maps of the future, showing Paul exactly where the next physical dangers are hidden. Paul is young and untested, leaving him without the mental framework required to process this sudden psychological assault. At the same time, the adults around him are making life or death choices driven by raw fear and the blind pursuit of ambition. Paul realizes that if he doesn't use these visions to guide his house, they will succumb to the chaos created by the people they trust most. These visions provide a new perspective on the political players around him, stripping away their public personas. Frank Herbert uses this foresight to expose the true nature of humanity, showing what people become when their masks are removed. Look at the relationships represented by these notes. The diagram reveals the strengths and crippling weaknesses of everyone in Paul's circle. Fear and ambition act as a corrosive force, severing these lines and creating dangerously real conflicts. Paul begins to use this data to map the fracture points of human loyalty, allowing him to anticipate exactly when a political ally will turn into a threat. Processing these multiple timelines puts an immense strain on Paul's mind, forcing his consciousness to expand to accommodate the sheer volume of information. Instead of shattering under the weight of the future, Paul finds that the pressure forces a period of rapid, involuntary intellectual growth. He starts to decode power. This pyramid structure represents how houses and empires traditionally exert control, but prophecy introduces a new variable, crushing the structure of standard politics and replacing old rules with something absolute. This realization forces Paul to change his definition of leadership. It's no longer just about issuing commands in the present. True power, he discovers, is the ability to recognize and endure the consequences of choices that haven't even been made yet. Even with this new prophetic insight, Paul must still contend with the physical reality of the planet beneath his feet. Look at the scale of the shadow. Despite any human foresight, the desert remains a humbling, absolute authority that can erase them in an instant. Paul eventually moves past his initial fear, stepping out of his role as a vulnerable youth and into his role as a leader. This requires a grim trade. To protect his family and his future, Paul must sacrifice his own autonomy, making choices that prioritize the survival of the group over his own peace of mind. Herbert weaves these threads, the danger of the desert, the fragility of the family, and the heavy burden of foresight, into a story that is as vast and unforgiving as Arrakis itself.
Arrakis is defined by scale. From above, the sun-baked dunes look perfectly still, but this desert is an active, overwhelming force that tolerates few mistakes. To survive here, let alone extract the universe's most valuable resource, spice, requires brute force. It means dropping massive, loud machinery onto the sand to scrape the surface in a landscape that actively tries to swallow it whole. And that rhythmic noise acts as a beacon. When a massive disturbance under the sand zeroes in on an active spice harvester, the crew has only minutes before a sandworm breaches the surface. The standard political protocol of this universe is brutally simple. Heavy equipment and refined spice cost a fortune. The people operating them are entirely replaceable. If a harvester gets stuck, you abandon the crew to save the shipment. But Duke Leto Atreides chooses to ignore that rule. By throwing his own ship into the dust to pull those stranded workers off the sand, he throws away a fortune in spice. This deviation from the law of the great houses creates an immediate tension that his enemies will look to exploit. Inside Leto's rescue craft, the precision of a royal transport gives way to absolute chaos. Dust coats the viewports as the ship dives toward the doomed harvester, with every alarm screaming that they are out of time. On the ground, standard operating procedures evaporate. The workers fleeing the sinking machinery aren't soldiers following orders. They are terrified people driven by pure survival instinct, scrambling toward the only open hatch. This chart visualizes the precise logistical terror of Leto's operation. He has a rapidly shrinking window of time before the worm strikes, plotted against the strict physical limit of how many bodies can fit inside his ship. He strips his own craft of its defensive shields just to squeeze in every last worker. As the timeline runs out, we see the true cost of his command. On the left, the immense financial value of the swallowed harvester and its payload of spice drops drops sharply to 0. But on the right, the metric for extracted personnel maxes out. Every single life is pulled from the sand. This daring rescue confirms a specific strategy. Leto is trading massive material wealth for a resource the Imperium cannot manufacture, the loyalty of men who know their commander would die to save them. This decision echoes far beyond the dunes. Across the galaxy, Leto's political rivals are watching the casualty reports, evaluating a leader who values flesh and water over spice and steel. The standard Imperial strategy relies entirely on hoarding resources to starve your enemies and using the threat of violence to keep your subjects in line. It is an effective system, but a brittle one. Leto operates on a completely different philosophy. He leads by forging intense, family-like bonds.
By physically putting himself in the path of the sandworm to save his crew, he proves his commitment with his own life. Surviving that crucible accomplishes something fear never could. It emotionally and physically unites the Atreides forces. The survivors pulled from the sand now owe their lives to their Duke, creating a bond of personal trust that transcends standard military respect. And that is exactly why Leto is such a threat to his enemies. You can easily outbid a mercenary and easily intimidate a fearful servant, but loyalty built on saved lives cannot be bought, bribed, or intimidated. Sitting in the back of the crowded rescue craft, young Paul Atreides watches this entire sequence unfold. The physical action is over, and his focus shifts inward. Paul has spent his life reading theories about statecraft and politics. Watching his father risk the entire house to save a few dozen workers replaces that classroom knowledge with a visceral, practical understanding of how power is actually generated. The gravity of Leto's choice mirrors the heavy, isolating responsibilities connected to Paul's own emerging role. The young prince begins to realize the sacrifices that prophecy and leadership will demand of him. The architect behind these intersecting themes of ecology, politics, and human frailty is the author, Frank Herbert. He carefully structured this incident to expose the distinct human strengths and weaknesses of every character involved. The Spice Harvester rescue provides the blueprint for the story's philosophy. On Arrakis, the environment acts as a persistent test, forcing leaders to choose between the wealth they need to survive and the people they need to lead.
When House Atreides arrives on Arrakis, they are immediately entangled in a web of shifting loyalties and competing agendas. Every character brings their own political calculations to the table, sizing up the desert planet as just another board for their strategic maneuvers. They operate under the assumption that the same aristocratic rules and diplomatic strategies that worked across the Empire will secure their dominance here. But author Frank Herbert designed this narrative to challenge those expectations. He places his characters in an environment that actively resists human control. So while the lords and politicians believe they are pulling the strings, the planet itself remains the only true sovereign, indifferent to their titles. The desert of Arrakis is an environment defined by its breathtaking scale and the constant lethal reality of its shifting dunes. The physical expression of that unyielding power is the giant sandworm. The sheer size and violence of a worm attack reduces human beings to specks of dust. Seeing one breach the surface renders previous political squabbles and military posturing secondary to the immediate problem of survival. The worm acts as an immovable force, shattering any illusion that humanity will dominate this landscape. When the sand begins to rumble, the crisis acts as a catalyst. Every ounce of aristocratic pretense and political strategy vanishes in seconds. The characters' multi-layered strategies are forced through a bottleneck of panic, emerging as raw survival instincts. Down here, decisions branch into two paths: fear and loyalty. With hierarchies collapsing, these paths weave together to form a base of trust, keeping everyone alive. A person's character is laid bare when the threat of death eclipses their desire for power. Amidst this scrambling and terror, Paul Atreides is processing the event differently. While the group is consumed by the emergency, Paul stays focused, observing the chaos unfolding in the dust storm. He watches people abandon protocols to protect one another, analyzing the weight of sacrifice and vulnerability in real time. By absorbing these visceral reactions, he uncovers the mechanics of power on Arrakis, lessons that no royal court could teach him. By the time the worm retreats, Paul has witnessed a truth about power that no court lecture could simulate, that leadership in the desert is dictated by survival, not ceremony. Eventually, the dust settles and the physical danger retreats back into the deep desert. The survivors are left quiet, reevaluating their relationships and their chances of making it through the night. For Paul, the silence leaves a heavy realization about the crushing weight of his own destiny and the responsibilities tied to his future. He begins to recognize that prophecy is a severe, demanding burden that extracts a toll of personal sacrifice from those forced to carry it. To become the leader that Arrakis truly demands, he will have to navigate both human fragility and the dominance of nature. Looking at the broader scope of the novel, this scene serves as an essential structural anchor for the entire story. As you can see in this diagram, Herbert weaves together physical action, emotional vulnerability, and philosophical concepts, bringing them into a unified focus. This integration of visceral action and philosophy is why Frank Herbert's work remains a cornerstone of the genre decades after its publication. Ultimately, the sandworm acts as a mirror, forcing Paul to confront the fragility of his own ambitions against the overwhelming scale of the universe. House Atreides arrives on Arrakis as a unified force, operating in lockstep as ships touch down on an alien world that is relentlessly hostile. The planet presents a lethal contradiction. The endless dunes catch the light with a startling beauty, yet the total absence of moisture can kill an unprotected human in a matter of hours. Even with advanced shielding and the wealth of a great house, the Atreides cannot simply engineer their way out of the heat. The deep sands serve as a physical reminder that nature easily overpowers human technology. Because the environment demands absolute perfection for survival, the entire family is forced into a state of permanent hypervigilance. This constant external pressure leaves them uniquely vulnerable to the threats they cannot see. Within the relative safety of the stronghold, Lady Jessica discovers a far more immediate danger. Hidden enemies are already moving against the family from inside their own inner circle. This schematic of the Atreides compound highlights the problem. While the thick outer walls are designed to keep the desert ecology out, the actual sabotage originates from within, bypassing every external defense. This discovery instantly erodes the vacuum of trust. Survival now requires the family to fight a war on two fronts: the lethal weather system outside and the deadly hidden ambitions of the people they rely on. Pinned between an unlivable planet and an unseen traitor, the family enters the squeeze, a scenario where their traditional strengths are turned into existential vulnerabilities. Frank Herbert grounds the political intrigue of Dune in characters driven by recognizable human flaws, rather than simple malice. Every betrayal on the board is fueled by one of four core drivers: a paralyzing fear, a misplaced loyalty, raw ambition, or the sheer desperation to survive. These psychological traits act as compounding forces. Compressed under the stress of Arrakis, they push individuals toward political treason. This internal fracturing makes the threat impossible to track. Once trust is broken, paranoia taints every decision, splintering their ability to react to the desert. A direct military force is a known variable. The far more devastating danger is the way universal human weaknesses can be weaponized during a moment of planetary crisis. For the young heir Paul Atreides, this intersection of paranoia and environmental hostility serves as an accelerated classroom. The squeeze leaves no room for a typical upbringing. Paul is forced to abandon the innocence of youth and rapidly expand his intellectual grasp of the power dynamics around him. He must connect daily survival in the sand to the dawning realization that he is the focal point of a massive, ancient prophecy. This realization brings an immense weight. He begins to understand the isolation and the heavy physical toll connected to galactic leadership. Paul learns that the true price of power is the requirement to master two opposing forces: the unforgiving laws of the natural world and the unpredictable flaws of human nature. Lady Jessica's realization permanently shatters the illusion of safety. House Atreides can no longer afford the luxury of trust as they once understood it. This new reality forces the remaining loyalists to tighten their ranks, doubling down on family bonds as their only remaining defense. Survival requires a grim level of personal sacrifice. Every emotional and physical tie is tested by the magnitude of the ordeal they face. Arrakis systematically strips away the pageantry of the great houses. When the titles and ceremonies fall away, only absolute sacrificial loyalty remains as a tool for endurance. This specific section of the story serves as a microcosm for the entire novel's thematic structure. Herbert tethers the intimate psychological flaws of his characters to the awe-inspiring scale of a planetary danger. This specific alignment of internal emotional conflict and external philosophical complexity gives the narrative its lasting weight. Dune continues to resonate because it locates the universe's most destructive forces within the human psyche, specifically the fear and ambition of the person standing right beside you.
Look at Arrakis, a harsh, desolate wasteland completely hostile to human life. Yet this endless sand is the absolute geopolitical center of the universe. This network map shows how the Imperium actually functions. Every line of trade, every political alliance, and all interstellar travel relies entirely on spice melange, and Arrakis is the only place in the cosmos where spice is found. Whoever controls this single node dictates the flow of power across the entire empire. So when the Emperor strips stewardship of Arrakis from House Harkonnen and hands it to House Atreides, it looks like an incredible reward. But Duke Leto Atreides understands the reality of his new fiefdom. As he assumes control, he knows the gift is a carefully laid trap. Despite knowing the danger, Leto believes he can manage the risk. He trusts in his own leadership, the fierce loyalty of his men, and the calculations of his mentad.
He operates under the assumption that a smart enough defense can neutralize any threat. For months, the Atreides military machine works relentlessly. They hunt for spies, reinforce fortifications, and run exhausting security sweeps. Every day is spent scanning the horizon for an invisible enemy, creating a suffocating tension. They are waiting for a shoe to drop, entirely focused on fortifying their position. But the Atreides are preparing for a conventional conflict, relying on established rules of political combat. Their enemies, however, have already decided to tear those rules apart. When the Harkonnen assault finally arrives, it bypasses all political maneuvering. A massive fleet of dark troop transports drops out of the smog-filled sky, descending on key locations with devastating speed. This scale of destruction requires enormous wealth and deep systemic patience. The Harkonnen spent years invisibly positioning assets, pouring vast sums of money into intelligence gathering, and planting deep cover agents inside Arrakis long before a single ship took flight. The true danger lies in the secret driving the invasion. Baron Harkonnen didn't launch this massive assault alone. He forged a hidden alliance with the Emperor himself, combining their spheres of influence to form an inescapable ring around the isolated Atreides forces. The Emperor joined the conspiracy because Duke Leto was becoming too respected. Leto's honorable reputation and growing influence among the great houses made him a direct threat to the Emperor's supreme authority. As the massive invasion hits, the sheer size of the coordinated strike instantly paralyzes the entirety of the Atreides military. Months of careful planning, complex fortifications, and exhaustive security sweeps are rendered useless in a matter of hours. The assault proves that open political competition is an illusion. In this universe, victory belongs to those willing to weaponize immense wealth and absolute deception, completely ignoring the traditional boundaries of noble warfare.
The final blow for House Atreides comes in the form of a specific deployment, the Emperor's elite Sardaukar troops. The Sardaukar are the most feared, highly disciplined warriors in the known universe. Their brutal training makes them an unstoppable force, capable of breaking even the most hardened Atreides veterans. But they aren't flying Imperial colors. To hide his direct involvement, the Emperor dresses his elite soldiers in Harkonnen uniforms. The Sardaukar fight under a false flag, allowing the Emperor to destroy a rival noble house without openly violating Imperial law. Two opposite philosophies of power clash on the battlefield. Duke Leto built his rule on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. The Baron, however, constructed his victory out of fear, cruelty, and manipulation. The presence of those disguised Sardaukar shows that even the highest authority in the Imperium will abandon the law for the sake of political convenience. The Emperor, who is sworn to protect the peace between noble houses, has instead provided the tools for their murder. In the immediate aftermath of the assault, the Atreides military, their wealth, and their infrastructure cease to exist. The powerhouse Leto worked his entire life to build is reduced to smoldering rubble. Amidst the wreckage, the grand movements of armies and houses fall away. What remains is the desperate survival of Paul Atreides and his mother, Lady Jessica. Paul experiences a severe psychological shock. Overnight, the absolute security of his family and his status as a protected heir are violently erased. The structured reality he has known since birth is gone. Lady Jessica faces her own crisis.
The chaos of their escape forces her to push her Bene Gesserit training to its absolute limits, drawing on every ounce of discipline to navigate the hostile environment and keep her son alive. The Harkonnen attack proves that careful planning offers no real protection. The concept of certainty is destroyed, revealing that chaos, unpredictability, and betrayal are the true driving forces of human affairs. There is a profound irony in the Baron's victory. By burning away the safe world around Paul, the Harkonnens have stripped away the social and political limitations that kept him living as a nobleman. This displacement forces Paul into the deep desert. Within the walls of his father's palace, he was an heir to a title. Out here in the sands of Arrakis, he begins the long walk toward becoming Muad'Dib. When Duke Leto Atreides takes control of the desert planet Arrakis, he knows he is walking into a trap set by his mortal enemies, the Harkonnens. He accepts the assignment anyway. Refusing a direct order from the Emperor would project weakness and political cowardice to the rest of the universe. Leto's survival strategy relies on strict planning and a fiercely loyal inner circle. But he also operates under a grim assumption. Enemy agents have almost certainly infiltrated his operation. The challenge is rooting them out before the jaws of the trap snap shut. This knowledge breeds intense suspicion across the Atreides household. Mentat Thufir Hawat and weapons master Gurney Halleck constantly scan for threats, treating every shadow as a potential assassin. The paranoia runs so deep that they even begin to suspect the Duke's own partner, Lady Jessica, simply because of her mysterious Bene Gesserit training. Author Frank Herbert spends the early chapters of Dune actively encouraging this atmosphere of suspicion. He sets up a classic whodunit, conditioning the reader to look for a spy motivated by the usual vices: greed, political ambition, or a thirst for power. But the hunt for a conventional traitor is a deliberate misdirection. By keeping the Atreides locked in a cycle of paranoia, searching for a spy who fits a standard profile, they are completely blinded to the actual threat hiding right in plain sight. The true betrayer is Dr. Wellington Yue. As the trusted family physician, he is the single least likely suspect in the entire Atreides organization. Yue has undergone imperial conditioning, an absolute psychological safeguard engineered to make a physician physically incapable of causing harm. Because this is considered flawless, Yue holds absolute trust, bypassing every paranoid security filter Thufir Hawat put in place. Baron Harkonnen understands that a Suk doctor cannot be bribed with wealth or manipulated with promises of power, but they can be broken through overwhelming, unquantifiable emotional pain. The Harkonnens have captured Yue's wife, Wana. By subjecting her to extreme torture, the Baron weaponizes Yue's desperate love for her. Yue complies with the enemy's demands solely on the faint hope of saving her, or at least discovering her final fate. House Atreides doesn't fall because of poor military tactics or flawed mentat calculations. The Harkonnens crack the perfect security system by treating raw human emotion as a zero-day vulnerability. From inside the compound, Yue systematically disables the Atreides' defenses. He severs critical security lines and powers down the energy shields protecting the main structure. With the barriers down, Harkonnen troops swarm the facility. The attack is swift and total, culminating in the capture of Duke Leto himself. What makes Yue so compelling is that he acts without a trace of malice. He deeply respects Duke Leto and genuinely loves the family he is actively destroying. Even as he hands the Duke over to his executioners, Yue orchestrates a final, desperate act of defiance. He implants a fake poison tooth in Leto's mouth, giving the captive Duke a lethal weapon to assassinate the Baron. Yue is trapped in an impossible contradiction. To strike a fatal blow against the man who tortured his wife, he has to dismantle the institution he swore to protect. He acts as a traitor and a resistance fighter in the exact same breath. For Paul Atreides, the betrayal strips away the protection of his mentors. He is cast out of a world where safety was a given, forced to realize that any alliance, no matter how ancient, can be severed by a single point of failure. So Lady Jessica, the fall of the house validates her deepest fears, that love is not a strength, but a target for exploitation. As a Bene Gesserit, she understands that the more a person cares for another, the more leverage they provide to their enemies. This battered cover represents a story that avoids clean moral answers. By positioning Yue as both a victim and a villain, Herbert forces us to weigh the cost of absolute treachery against the crushing weight of extreme coercion. Military might, mentat calculation, and psychological conditioning all share the same point of failure: the people tasked with maintaining them. No matter how many layers of security are built around a leader, those layers are only as strong as the human beings at the center. The fall of the Atreides demonstrates that superior firepower isn't the primary threat to an empire. A regime collapses the moment an enemy identifies the one person whose personal grief outweighs their professional duty. The Imperium is a brutal Machiavellian political landscape. Survival requires standard tools of the trade: authoritarian rule, paranoia, and the calculated application of fear. Duke Leto Atreides is a singular anomaly in this environment. He doesn't demand obedience through threats. He secures his position by earning the loyalty of those around him. This is evident in his inner circle. Figures like Thufir Hawat, Swordmaster Duncan Idaho, and Gurney Halleck are lethal experts who could serve any master, yet they follow Leto out of genuine dedication to his character. Operating on trust creates a dangerous friction point. In a system built to reward the most ruthless actor, a leader who relies on mutual respect becomes a highly visible target. This virtuous leadership style is precisely what creates his political vulnerability. By being an honorable ruler, Leto inadvertently signals a challenge to the existing order. This network map shows how the political landscape shifts. The central hub represents traditional authoritarian power, but notice the momentum. Leto's popularity is drawing influence away from the center, accumulating around the Atreides node. To the Baron Harkonnen, this is a measurable threat. The mechanics driving these two nodes are opposites. The Harkonnen structure relies on fear and cruelty to maintain its grip, while the Atreides model is built on shared purpose. Can an architecture of power built on honor survive a collision with an enemy who actively weaponizes cruelty? The answer arrives on Arrakis through a suffocating trap. Despite Leto's preparations, he is facing a level of coordination his house cannot match. The fatal flaw isn't tactical, it's personal. The betrayal by Dr. Yue bypasses every intelligence shield and defensive preparation Leto had in place. The result is a total systemic collapse. In a single night, the Atreides military is destroyed, their allies are scattered, and the family is placed in immediate mortal peril. Even in the hands of his enemies, Leto refuses to bargain. He maintains a quiet dignity, shifting his entire focus toward the only thing that still matters: the survival of Paul and Jessica. Ultimately, Leto's idealism was outmaneuvered. His leadership was exceptional, but it was physically overwhelmed by a vast, ruthless conspiracy he could not control. Dr. Ye, moved by a lingering sense of duty, leaves Leto with one final option for revenge. He replaces one of the Duke's teeth with a capsule of deadly poison gas. In the confrontation that follows, the Baron Harkonnen is celebratory and vain, blinded by what he perceives as total victory. Leto, however, remains calm, accepting his death to focus on a final strike. Leto understands the calculus. He cannot save himself, but he can use his final moments to disrupt the enemy's victory and eliminate the Baron. Waiting for his arrogant enemy to step into the closest possible range, the fallen Duke finally bites down and crushes the poison tooth. But the Baron survives. His personal suspensor technology lifts him away from the gas at the last possible second, leaving him shaken but alive. The Duke's final act falls short of its tactical goal. In this physical confrontation, the mechanisms of fear and manipulation have successfully defeated honor. Politically, House Atreides appears finished. The Emperor and the Baron believe the board has been cleared, and their victory is undisputed. The narrative reflects a cold reality. In a complex universe, noble character and moral idealism do not guarantee physical survival. Yet Leto's death becomes a catalyst for his son. The tragedy forces Paul to abandon his role as heir and assume leadership prematurely, driving him toward his transformation into Muad'Dib. For Jessica, the loss of the man she loved leaves an emotional scar that shapes her strategic decisions, grounding her actions in the mutual respect they shared. Leto's refusal to submit passively remains his most enduring contribution. It creates a legacy that inspires fierce, unbreakable loyalty among the survivors who will continue the fight. The fall of Duke Leto shows that while authoritarian power can win the immediate battle through overwhelming violence, a foundation built on honor and shared purpose can shape the future long after the ruler is gone. The attack on Arrakis has succeeded. Duke Leto is dead, his forces are overwhelmed, and the ruling structure of House Atreides has been reduced to ash. To the Baron Harkonnen, victory is a simple equation of ledgers and corpses. He measures his political dominance by counting the armies he crushes and the planetary assets he seizes. By his own metrics, his triumph is absolute. He orders his agents to fly Paul and Lady Jessica deep into the wilderness and abandon them. The objective is to let the harsh environment eliminate his enemies quietly, avoiding the political complications that a public execution might provoke. Overnight, every layer of physical protection Paul and Jessica have ever relied on vanishes. The sprawling security details, the personal energy shields, the vast wealth of their bloodline, all of it is gone. With the total erasure of their external defenses, a massive vacuum is left behind. When the political and military arsenals are entirely emptied, the only things keeping them alive are the weapons they carry in their minds. Captured and loaded into a thopter, Paul and Jessica find themselves trapped mid-flight with the Harkonnen assassins who intend to leave them to die. Rather than succumbing to panic, Jessica relies on years of intensive Bene Gesserit instruction. Her emotional discipline and total self-control become her primary line of defense. We can see the mechanics of her training in this diagram tracking a human body's physiological responses. The Bene Gesserit technique known as the voice appears to be magic, but it is actually a highly disciplined application of human observation. By closely studying a target's micro-expressions and body language, a trained user can locate precise psychological weaknesses and physical stress points. Once those vulnerabilities are mapped, the user modulates their vocal frequencies to match the target's psychological state. The resulting verbal command slips past a target's conscious defenses, overriding their erratic impulses with a directive that is almost impossible to resist. Jessica deploys this exact technique against her guards in the thopter. By turning their own fears and rivalries against them through carefully pitched commands, she manipulates them into fighting each other,
achieving total dominance of the cabin without throwing a single punch. Beside her, Paul adapts to the chaos. This high-pressure environment forces his fragmented education, his noble upbringing, his combat drills, and his own Bene Gesserit conditioning to lock together. He stops waiting for rescue and starts taking an active role in determining their fate. When traditional force is stripped away, the mastery of human psychology and self-control determines the victor. The Harkonnens' superior numbers and heavy weapons are rendered entirely useless against disciplined minds. Escaping the assassins is only the first step. As they flee deeper into the wilderness, the threat shifts from Harkonnen blades to the environment itself. The planet Arrakis acts as an impartial judge. It does not care about noble bloodlines or political significance. Any lingering assumptions of aristocratic privilege hold exactly zero value in the sand. They are suddenly exposed to extreme heat, an almost complete lack of water, and the constant threat of giant sandworms hunting beneath their feet. Surviving these conditions requires immediate, ruthless adaptation. Outwitting the captors in the Thopter was merely a baseline test. Staying alive now demands continuous biological and behavioral evolution to meet the standards of the deadliest ecosystem in the Imperium. The sheer trauma and exhaustion of navigating this lethal wilderness acts as a catalyst. Under the immense stress of the desert, Paul's dormant prescient abilities are violently forced into action. This graph illustrates his prescience. It's not a singular roadmap. Instead, Paul experiences a chaotic, terrifying influx of branching possibilities, rapidly multiplying into overwhelming noise. This foresight provides immediate guidance, but as the paths converge, he faces the crushing awareness of an unavoidable galactic destiny. Frank Herbert specifically constructed this brutal sequence to permanently sever Paul and Jessica from their comfortable pasts. The physical escape is a mechanism designed to force their evolution. While their bodies are running from enemy forces, their minds are undergoing an irreversible shift. The old identities of a protected heir and a duke's concubine are stripped away and left in the dunes. The Harkonnens believed they were quietly burying the remnants of a broken dynasty in the sand. Instead, this crucible forced Paul and Jessica to rely entirely on their own minds and training. The attempt to destroy House Atreides is exactly what planted the seed that will eventually conquer the universe.
House Atreides held immense political power. They commanded vast armies, enjoyed noble privileges, and operated from heavily fortified strongholds. Within days, that entire structure shattered. Duke Leto is dead. The Atreides military forces are wiped out. The political titles that commanded respect across the galaxy suddenly mean absolutely nothing on the ground. Paul and Lady Jessica are pushed out into the wastes. Every external layer of aristocratic protection they relied on their entire lives is gone. Every asset that once defined their lives, water, shelter, and allies, is now out of reach. In this environment, an aristocratic title carries no more weight than the sand beneath their feet. The deep desert of Arrakis acts as an uncompromising executioner. It actively targets and eliminates anyone who fails to adapt to its strict conditions. The threats are massive and overlapping. Daytime temperatures reach lethal extremes. Water is entirely absent from the surface, and massive, terrifying sandworms patrol the dunes, reacting to rhythmic vibrations. Yet, a distinct paradox exists here. The same environment that effortlessly destroys wealthy, well-armed outsiders sustains the native Fremen, who have learned exactly how to thrive within it. Author Frank Herbert designed this brutal ecology for a specific reason: to test the absolute limits of his characters. You cannot fight a planet with military force. Survival demands strict submission to the ecological rules of Arrakis, or you die. The sudden lack of physical energy shields forces an immediate shift in strategy. Paul and Jessica have to rely entirely on internal mental and physical adaptability to stay alive. Paul starts synthesizing fragmented lessons from his past. He takes Gurney Halleck's combat instincts, Thufir Hawat's strategic calculations, and Duncan Idaho's survival training, combining them into cohesive tactics for the sand. At the same time, Jessica taps into her rigorous Bene Gesserit discipline. She forces her mind to compartmentalize the overwhelming trauma of losing Leto, so she can focus purely on the physical steps required to keep moving. Before the attack, their knowledge of Arrakis was academic. Now they are experiencing the violent, immediate reality of living those textbook lessons. The desert functions as a severe exam for applied knowledge. If a theoretical concept fails out here, the cost is immediately paid with their lives. On Arrakis, water is the ultimate scarcity. It is an element so precious that the lack of it dictates the culture, values, and daily behavior of everyone on the planet. This diagram shows the Fremen's stillsuit. It is the critical technological response to this environmental absolute. The suit actively recycles bodily moisture. As the wearer sweats or breathes, the mechanics capture the water, filter it, and funnel it into a collection pouch, preventing lethal dehydration. Herbert's narrative design prioritizes practical, life-sustaining innovations. The focus remains on tools that filter breath and capture sweat, grounding the story in the cold reality of biological necessity. This interconnectedness expands to the planetary scale. The desert is a highly complex, living ecosystem with precise rules and balances, rather than a stretch of empty dead space. The giant sandworms serve as the apex predators of this system, and they are directly linked to the biological production of spice. They anchor the entire economy of the planet. Mastering Arrakis requires fully understanding these chains. Technology, biology, and the economy are inextricably locked to the planet's environmental constraints. The sheer physical exhaustion of the desert strips away their old identities, triggering deep psychological and spiritual changes in both characters. Jessica faces a severe internal crisis. She has to sacrifice her protective instincts as a mother, accepting her Bene Gesserit realization that Paul is meant for a harsh, difficult fate that she can no longer shield him from. For Paul, the extreme environmental stress, combined with heavy exposure to ambient spice in the air, violently awakens his prescient abilities. This prescience becomes a crushing burden. Instead of providing a clear path forward, it reveals multiple branching futures, creating a paralyzing sense of uncertainty. Paul is now caught between the physical heat of the dunes and the psychological weight of these branching timelines. He is no longer just fighting to find water. He is fighting to maintain his sense of self, as his innocence is overwritten by the potential for future violence. By the time their desert trek ends, their status has shifted. They have entirely shed their roles as fleeing aristocratic victims and become hardened survivors. Their shared trauma forces a new dynamic. Mother and son establish absolute trust and cooperation, recognizing they cannot survive the elements alone. Their view of the Fremen shifts as well. They stop seeing them as primitive desert dwellers and begin respecting them as masters of a highly sophisticated ecology. The fall of House Atreides severed their ties to the past, shedding the dead weight of their noble lineage to allow for entirely new growth. The heat and isolation have stripped away the vulnerable heir. What remains is a survivor whose every instinct has been sharpened by the sand, the foundation for the figure known as Muad'Dib.
From the day he was born, Paul Atreides was engineered to rule. His father, Duke Leto, ensured the boy mastered military strategy, planetary politics, and close-quarters combat. His mother, Lady Jessica, layered a completely different curriculum in secret. She trained Paul in the Bene Gesserit disciplines, a rigorous mental and physical conditioning that granted him acute awareness of his surroundings and complete command over his own nervous system. The lethal Gom Jabbar test administered by Reverend Mother Moyam proves these dual tracks of education produced an extreme anomaly. Paul endures an induced agony that would shatter an ordinary mind. His survival suggests he might be the Kwisatz Haderach. For thousands of years, the Bene Gesserit manipulated bloodlines across the galaxy to produce a single male capable of bridging space and time through his mind. At this stage, Paul views himself simply as a well-educated aristocrat preparing to lead his house. He remains completely unaware that his own biology is the culmination of centuries-long breeding experiment, waiting for a trigger. That trigger arrives when the political safety net of House Atreides is wiped out overnight in a highly coordinated military ambush. Now stripped of his armies and his ancestral wealth, Paul is forced to flee into the deep deserts of Arrakis.
He carries a supreme, tightly coiled genetic potential, but he must now test it against an environment designed to kill anything that makes a mistake. Surviving the deep sands requires total physiological adaptation. The brutal climate forces his meticulously conditioned mind and body to react, acting as a violent catalyst for his hidden abilities. Arrakis operates as an aggressive biological agent on anyone walking its surface. The desert is saturated with melange, the psychoactive spice. Paul absorbs heavy doses of it with every breath of air, every mouthful of food, and every layer of dust that settles on his skin. This relentless chemical exposure begins to crosswire with his extreme Bene Gesserit conditioning and his engineered DNA. The massive, involuntary spice intake forces his mind to bypass the gradual steps of his previous training, instantly triggering all of his latent potential. The author, Frank Herbert, deliberately avoids the standard literary trope of the chosen one receiving a flawless, singular vision. Paul does not look into a crystal ball and see a fixed, guaranteed sequence of events. Look at this single node representing the present. His mind absorbs thousands of micro-details, projecting them forward and splintering them into a sprawling web of probable outcomes. Amidst this map, he perceives narrow threads of survival perfectly parallel to scenarios of total catastrophe. He is forced to process the infinite variables of the universe simultaneously. This cosmic awareness transforms from an intellectual advantage into a paralyzing, crushing mental weight. This internal chaos collides immediately with the local population. The Fremen hold tightly to a prophecy that an off-world Messiah will arrive to liberate them. But this religion was artificially manufactured. Centuries ago, the Bene Gesserit deployed an operation called the Missionaria Protectiva, intentionally seeding vulnerable planets with superstitions that future sisters could exploit for safety. Paul recognizes these implanted myths through his visions. He sees the horrific reality that his genuine, painful mental expansion perfectly matches the cynical checkboxes of a fake religion. Leaning into the role of the savior guarantees him an army of fiercely loyal protectors, but exploiting their deep-seated faith threatens to whip the Fremen into a violent frenzy that he will not be able to stop. His expanded mind allows him to see the levers of this sociological trap, yet survival demands he pull them, locking him into a system of psychological control, where he becomes a prisoner of his own myth. This dynamic highlights a severe philosophical crisis for Paul, the collision between determinism and free will. When we look back at the web of possible futures, specific, bloody outcomes start collapsing into a single gravity well, pulling countless timelines toward a massive galactic war. He watches this convergence happen in his mind. He questions whether his knowledge gives him the agency to steer away from the violence, or simply forces him into perfectly executing it. The paradox of extreme foresight is that seeing every possible path does not grant ultimate freedom. It strips away the ability to choose entirely. Even his mother begins to look at him with a deep, quiet terror. Lady Jessica realizes that by choosing to have a son instead of a daughter, she accelerated a volatile biological experiment decades ahead of schedule, completely severing it from the sisterhood's control. Paul has moved past his identity as Duke Leto's heir. He is now an unprecedented entity, functioning far beyond the limits of ordinary human capability. This evolution destroys any semblance of peace. He calculates the infinite consequences of every word he speaks and every step he takes, trapped under the crushing weight of his actions. In the universe of Dune, absolute awareness traps the hero under the crushing burden of omniscience, turning a survival instinct into the catalyst for a galaxy-spanning holy war.
Paul Atreides and Lady Jessica are running for their lives. House Atreides is a smoldering ruin, and the two survivors are desperately pushing deeper into the Arrakis desert to escape the slaughter. Just hours ago, they were the heirs to a galactic dukedom, backed by immense wealth and elite soldiers. Now, that status has been stripped away. They are completely isolated and ruthlessly hunted by Harkonnen patrols. They possess almost no water or shelter, leaving them entirely vulnerable to an environment that kills anyone unprepared within hours. To endure, they must find a source of power that the Imperium doesn't recognize,
one that exists outside the rules of noble authority. While Paul and Jessica struggle to survive, the Harkonnens are celebrating. To them, the war for Arrakis is already over, and the outcome is settled. This confidence stems from a refusal to acknowledge the planet's native population. Imperial authorities categorize the Fremen as a few disorganized, primitive tribes, a rounding error that has no impact on planetary control. This chart shows how the Imperium calculates strength. Power flows from the Emperor, through the wealth of the great houses, to their standing armies. The native ecology and its people are treated as a separate, meaningless variable. By defining power strictly through ledgers and military spending, the ruling class creates a massive institutional blind spot. They are completely ignoring the very people who possess the capacity to dismantle their entire system. The collision between these two worlds occurs when the exhausted refugees stumble into Stilgar's troop. The tension is immediate. On Arrakis, a stranger is rarely a friend. This encounter reveals the central reality of Arrakis. The environment dictates the culture. Every custom the Fremen observe is a direct response to the scarcity of the desert. Because water is life, the Fremen view strangers with extreme caution. To them, an unknown wanderer is either a threat to their hidden resources or a physical source of moisture to be reclaimed for the tribe. Jessica navigates this by relying on her Bene Gesserit training. She doesn't demand respect based on her noble title. Instead, she uses physical self-control and observation to prove she is a tactical asset to Stilgar. This negotiation proves that in the deep desert, aristocratic bloodlines are worthless. On Arrakis, absolute discipline and practical utility are the only metrics of value. However, the Fremen's acceptance of Paul isn't just based on his survival skills. It is guided by religious myths planted among the tribes centuries before his arrival. This star map tracks the reach of the Missionaria Protectiva. This was a survival protocol where the Bene Gesserit seeded superstitious legends on harsh worlds, ensuring that any stranded sister could later use those myths to find protection. We can see how those seeds grew into a complex web of messianic expectations. During this meeting, the Fremen begin mapping these ancient prophecies directly onto Paul's actions. Paul is presciently aware of this process. He sees the tribe projecting their hopes onto him and recognizes the extreme danger of weaponizing that religious fervor for political gain. This is the moment Paul stops being a hunted refugee. By stepping into these myths, he becomes a volatile religious figurehead with the power to mobilize an entire world. Paul makes a calculated choice to abandon his former identity. He realizes that to survive, he must stop being a noble heir and integrate fully into Fremen society. As he joins them, he discovers the hidden reality the Imperium missed. The Fremen are a highly sophisticated, unified society, defined by absolute resource efficiency and collective discipline. Generations of daily survival in the harshest environment in the universe have hardened them. This constant struggle has quietly produced warriors who are far superior to any conventional imperial army. The Fremen prove that while wealth and titles create the appearance of power, extreme environmental hardship is the ultimate crucible for creating an unstoppable fighting force. Beyond offering sanctuary, the Fremen provide Paul with the community and education he needs to weaponize the desert ecosystem itself. This illustrates Frank Herbert's central theme. The power to topple a galactic order doesn't come from established authority, but from marginalized, overlooked corners. The meeting with Stilgar is the definitive bridge in Paul's journey. It marks the end of House Atreides and the birth of his new identity as Muad'Dib. This single encounter permanently shatters the Imperium's illusion of control. It lays the foundation for a revolution that will ultimately rewrite the political structure of the entire known universe.
House Atreides is destroyed. Duke Leto is dead. The Harkonnens have reclaimed the capital, and Paul and his mother Jessica are vanishing into the deep desert of Arrakis as hunted fugitives. Out in the open dunes, they are entirely cut off from civilization. Their only viable path to survival requires the help of the Fremen, an insular, deeply hardened society living completely off the grid.
The desert enforces strict pragmatism. Scarcity dictates every action. If a new addition to the tribe cannot contribute to the collective survival of the group, they become a liability. And out here, liabilities get people killed. This creates an immediate problem for Paul. Up until now, he has been a duke's heir. He lived a life surrounded by vast wealth, political influence, and imperial lineage. Out on the sand, all of those noble titles disintegrate. They hold absolutely zero value. The question is simple. How exactly does a teenager raised in a palace convince a tribe of ruthless desert survivalists to keep him breathing? Enter Stilgar. As a Fremen leader, he evaluates Paul much like an accountant looking at a strict ledger. He assesses the boy purely on his potential as an asset to the tribe, completely ignoring any idea of a messiah. Paul makes a highly calculated choice in response. He drops his aristocratic ego. Instead of demanding the respect typical of an imperial noble, he approaches the tribe with humility and asks to learn their ways. He quickly picks up their strict water discipline and masters the mechanics of traveling safely across the deep sands. This immediate competence shows Stilgar that the boy can pull his own weight. Look at this portrait of author Frank Herbert. You can almost see the analytical mindset he applied to the novel. He deliberately designed this entire section to illustrate a core ecological truth. Adapting to a harsh environment works far better than trying to conquer it. Paul's initial foot in the door is a direct result of that adaptation. His acceptance into the community is a strict transaction based entirely on what he can do for the tribe. Proving basic competence is only the first step. Paul is quickly forced into a mandatory cultural test, ritual combat to the death against a Fremen warrior named Jamis. Paul has received elite military training from men like Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck. He is clearly the superior fighter, but he heavily hesitates to land a killing blow. This reluctance deeply confuses the onlookers, who interpret it as a lack of respect. The duel acts as a brutal coming of age. By finally striking Jamis down, Paul ends his adolescence. He shoulders the heavy, immediate moral weight of taking another human life. The fight ends, but the cultural machinery kicks into gear. Fremen justice dictates a communal rebalancing, where the victor must fully absorb the life of the defeated. In this tribal structure, Paul's win brings a specific set of new burdens. He immediately takes ownership of Jamis's physical possessions, his water rings, and the heavy obligation of caring for Jamis's surviving family. The real function of the fight is integration. It inextricably ties Paul into the complicated daily social fabric of the desert people. This integration is smoothed by an unexpected overlap in values. The concepts of honor and duty that Duke Leto drilled into Paul map perfectly onto the Fremen demands for loyalty and strict discipline. His mother, Jessica, acts as a massive force multiplier here. She demonstrates elite Bene Gesserit combat skills and strategic thinking, proving her own worth and instantly elevating them from ordinary refugees to highly respected assets. Then, a third factor accelerates their rise. Generations ago, the Bene Gesserit planted an engineered set of religious myths on Arrakis, a program called the Missionaria Protectiva. These dormant myths act as a psychological framework for the tribe. Because of these legends, many Fremen watch Paul and Jessica survive the desert and begin interpreting their highly practical skills as the fulfillment of divine prophecies. Paul secures his place through raw utility, while pre-existing religious propaganda elevates that utility into something entirely different. The combination aligns his survival skills with the tribe's deepest held beliefs. The Atreides refugee who slid down the dunes a few weeks prior is gone. In his place is a young man who has built a hardened, grounded identity directly from the sand. It proves that true power on Arrakis is immune to bribery or bloodlines. It has to be earned through total submission to the planet's brutal realities. By fully embracing those realities, Paul gains the tools required to strike back at the Harkonnens, an impossibly loyal community and a terrifying new purpose. The aristocratic heir had to die in the deep desert. That death was the absolute prerequisite for the birth of Muad'Dib and the eventual conquest of the entire Imperium. The Atreides refugee who slid down the dunes a few weeks prior is gone. Now, in his place, is a young man who has carefully built a hardened, grounded identity directly from the sand. It proves that true power on Arrakis is immune to bribery or bloodlines. It has to be earned through total submission to the planet's brutal realities. By fully embracing those realities, Paul gains the tools required to strike back at the Harkonnens, an impossibly loyal community and a terrifying new purpose. The aristocratic heir had to die in the deep desert. That symbolic death was the absolute prerequisite for the birth of Muad'Dib and the eventual conquest of the entire Imperium. The broader Imperium is built on excess. Powerful factions control lush, resource-rich planets, operating with a massive margin for waste. They maintain this grip by relying heavily on brute force to dominate their surroundings. Arrakis offers no such leniency. The desert planet strips away that margin entirely. It demands absolute respect and swiftly kills anyone who attempts to conquer it through sheer force. When House Atreides falls, young Paul and his mother Jessica find themselves violently stripped of their noble wealth. They are thrust into the deep desert as helpless outsiders, forced to navigate an unforgiving landscape. Most Imperial authorities possess a massive blind spot regarding this environment. They dismiss the people who actually live out here, the Fremen, as disorganized scavengers barely clinging to survival. To stay alive, Paul has to completely unlearn his rigid Imperial mindset. He must figure out exactly what these desert dwellers understand about survival that the rest of the galaxy has completely missed. Out on the dunes, water is the absolute baseline of existence. Because moisture is so scarce, its strict conservation dictates every single Fremen custom, ritual, and daily habit. This physical reality translates directly into their social behavior. Offering someone a drink is an act of profound trust. Shedding tears, a common emotional release on other worlds, becomes the ultimate voluntary sacrifice of precious moisture. This strict conservation extends even to how they handle death. Instead of burying or cremating the deceased, the Fremen use specialized technology to reclaim the body's water, returning it directly to the tribe. To an outsider, rendering a body down for its moisture looks harsh, but on Arrakis, it is a deeply respectful, entirely rational contribution to the community, driven entirely by ecological necessity. This diagram shows how a Fremen siege operates. These optimized underground systems capture and cycle resources to support massive populations. Living quarters feed directly into communal reservoirs. The harsh environment leaves zero room for selfishness. Personal ambition must serve the collective group. Paul absorbs this community-first mentality by observing Stilgar, the siege leader. Through Stilgar's direct mentorship, Paul learns how shared responsibility ensures the group's continued existence. The meticulous engineering of these settlements proves that the Fremen are highly sophisticated architects of their own survival, far removed from the primitive scavengers the Imperium imagines them to be. Then there are the giant sandworms, known as Shai-Hulud. Rather than trying to fight or exterminate these terrifying apex predators, the Fremen have fully adapted their lifestyle to coexist with them. They use specialized mechanics for desert travel. By moving in an uneven, erratic sliding pattern, they avoid creating the steady, rhythmic vibrations that would otherwise summon a worm to their location. This highlights a core philosophical split. The Fremen achieve mastery by studying and adapting to the rules of nature, rather than stubbornly trying to force nature to adapt to them. This intense physical adaptation is paired with a rigid spiritual framework. Years earlier, an order known as the Bene Gesserit planted specific religious legends among the desert population through an engineering program called the Missionaria Protectiva. When Paul and Jessica arrive, the Fremen recognize their appearance and actions as direct fulfillments of these engineered legends. This shared recognition instantly binds the tribe's loyalty to Paul, though his prescient visions warn that such absolute religious devotion can easily spiral into a violent, galaxy-wide holy war. Author Frank Herbert crafted this world to demonstrate how harsh ecological realities and religious fervor can intertwine to form an unbreakable foundation for a society. Paul's survival depends on internalizing every aspect of this culture. He must master the physical rhythms of the deep desert alongside the psychological architecture of the Fremen belief system. Because the Imperium completely misread the Fremen, they missed a massive threat. Hidden away in their sieges, they built advanced survival technology, a formidable military capability, and an unexpectedly massive population.
This map reveals their ultimate ambition under visionary Leet Kynes, a secret project to terraform Arrakis. Notice the timeline advancing through centuries. They commit immense labor to a project taking generations, sacrificing for a future they will never personally see. This level of patience and unified purpose stands in stark contrast to the politically fragmented, incredibly short-sighted nature of the imperial noble houses. Paul sees clearly that a society capable of this degree of collective sacrifice and long-term planning possesses a strength that no single military force can match. By internalizing these systems of environmental adaptation and communal resilience, Paul secures the loyalty of a population organized for total sacrifice. As Muad'Dib, he can now direct this hidden ecological engine to reshape the galaxy.
Paul Atreides has survived the destruction of his family, but finding himself stranded in the deep desert brings a stark realization. His imperial title as the heir to a great house holds exactly zero value here. His survival rests with men like Stilgar, a Fremen naib or tribal leader. Stilgar carries the absolute burden of his people's lives. In an environment this lethal, the tribe survives only through extreme insularity and caution. This creates an immediate clash of interests. Paul desperately needs the Fremen if he wants to live through the week, but to the Fremen, outsiders are an inherent liability who almost always bring danger. Paul cannot rely on his noble name, his bloodline, or his mother's Bene Gesserit training to secure a place among them. Instead, he must submit to a silent, rigorous evaluation by a hardened pragmatist who judges entirely on capability. The deep desert strips away the illusions of imperial power. An entitled heir is forced to prove his practical, daily usefulness to a society that does not care about kings. The first phase of Stilgar's evaluation happens during Paul's duel with Jameis. By defeating an experienced fighter, Paul proves his undeniable combat competence. But the defining moment occurs after the fight. Paul does not celebrate the victory. He recognizes the gravity of taking a human life and openly grieves the necessity of his actions. Many in the tribe misinterpret this reaction, seeing his grief as confusion or weakness. Stilgar reads the situation through a different rubric. He sees that Paul's compassion does not blunt his lethal edge. Rather, it highlights his emotional restraint. Stilgar values lethal capacity only when it is governed by strict discipline. Recognizing that a person can commit violence without enjoying it separates a true leader from someone who merely knows how to kill. Most outsiders arrive on Arrakis looking to conquer the landscape, viewing the desert as an enemy and dismissing the Fremen as primitives. Paul takes a radically different approach. This diagram shows the moisture recycling loop of a Fremen stillsuit. Paul instinctively grasps this water conservation. He applies that same adaptability to the culture, approaching Fremen customs with genuine curiosity to learn their ways rather than imposing his own. This cultural humility provides Stilgar with vital proof. It shows that Paul intends to contribute to the community's survival as an active participant rather than exploiting them as a resource. Generations earlier, the Bene Gesserit Missionaria Protectiva seeded Arrakis with engineered legends of a prophesied savior to ensure stranded sisters could manipulate the local population. As Paul's prescient abilities emerge, his actions align remarkably well with these exact legends. It presents him with a dangerously easy path to power through religious fervor. Stilgar, however, is deeply practical. While others in the tribe might be swept away by the intoxicating allure of prophecy, he refuses to let enthusiasm cloud his judgment. This animated diagram shows a balance scale, illustrating how Stilgar actively cross-references those religious myths against stringent, real-world observations of Paul and Jessica's actual competence. Stilgar grants his trust to the tangible man, whose character he has watched and vetted. It proves that in Fremen leadership, empirical observation and practical skill supersede the appeal of religious mythology. As Paul passes these silent tests, the dynamic between the two men slowly evolves. Stilgar shifts from a guarded protector evaluating an outsider into a partner engaged in a mutual alliance. He stops viewing Paul as a political refugee. Stilgar begins to see a student, a capable ally, and eventually a highly qualified successor. Because Stilgar is a universally respected naib, this personal endorsement carries massive sociological weight across Arrakis.
Looking at this network chart, we can map how Stilgar acts as the central node of trust. His acceptance functions as a vital domino, transferring his own earned confidence out to a wider, inherently skeptical Fremen population. That expanding network of trust grants Paul essential sociological legitimacy. It is a level of deep structural support that he could never have achieved through imperial mandate or sheer military force. The relationship proves that ultimate authority cannot be inherited by birthright, nor can it be entirely manufactured by myth. It must be rigorously earned through shared hardship, practical adaptability, and an observable, steady character.
House Atreides has fallen. Paul and his mother Jessica are hunted and exiled in the deep deserts of Arrakis. They have no armies, no wealth, and are stripped of traditional political resources. Their enemies, the Harkonnens, operate on a specific doctrine. In the Imperium, power is defined as pure military dominance, raw economic extraction, and control maintained through fear. But the Harkonnens suffer from a specific blind spot. They look at the native Fremen population and see nothing but primitive desert dwellers, scavengers with no bearing on the galactic balance of power. This scenario allows the novel's creator, Frank Herbert, to strip away the traditional levers of control. He uses Paul's exile to explore how political authority is built from the ground up, without inherited assets. Over his time in the desert, Paul rewrites the rules of influence. He builds a movement on Arrakis capable of toppling an empire by engineering shared belief. Paul's first strategic move is adaptation. Instead of acting like a colonizer demanding obedience, he watches, listens, and adopts Fremen customs, folding himself into the practical rhythms of their daily survival. This deliberate cultural integration earns him a political asset the Harkonnens lack: trust. The Fremen accept Paul because he respects their way of life, rather than trying to dominate. But Paul brings something else to the table. He's a weapon, forged by the universe's most sophisticated minds. He absorbed Duke Leto's leadership and Gurney Halleck's combat tactics. To this, he adds Thufir Hawat's strategy and Jessica's Bene Gesserit discipline. When you map this elite, multidisciplinary education onto the lethal realities of Arrakis, you get a leader whose sheer competence outpaces anything the desert tribes have seen before. Tactical capability paired with cultural respect turns Paul into a highly valued member of the tribe. He secures his physical survival by establishing a bedrock of legitimate authority. The nature of Paul's power shifts when his mother, Jessica, undergoes a dangerous trial to become a Reverend Mother. Her new title carries spiritual weight among the Fremen. This acts as a protective shield for Paul, elevating his practical leadership into a divine mandate. This elevation taps into a mechanism of manipulation planted generations ago. The Bene Gesserit order had run a program called the Missionaria Protectiva, seeding remote planets with myths and messianic prophecies to protect their members in the future. Paul realizes the Fremen are interpreting his tactical victories through the lens of these planted legends. They are primed to see him as their promised savior. Knowing these beliefs were manufactured makes Paul uncomfortable, but he uses them. He relies on his expanding prescient visions to align with Fremen religious expectations. Because he can glimpse possible futures, he anticipates outcomes that ordinary humans cannot. To his followers, his strategic perfection looks like a god walking among them. By fusing his tactical competence with this manufactured mythology, Paul creates a political structure secured by absolute, unquestioning devotion. With this devotional power secured, Paul's ambitions expand outward. He stops looking at his situation as a quest for personal revenge and starts looking at how he can reshape the balance of power across the entire universe. With the Harkonnens missed, Paul sees clearly. The Fremen are a massive, dense, highly trained military population, forged by the harshest environment in the galaxy. Under the banner of a unified Messiah, this native force possesses the discipline and the numbers to challenge the supreme military institutions of the Imperium. A note of warning: there is a flaw in this design. Political power built on religious fanaticism is volatile. Once that kind of devotional fire is lit, you cannot easily direct it, and you cannot switch it off. Paul begins to suffer from terrifying glimpses of the future. He sees a bloody holy war spreading across the stars, carried out by billions of followers slaughtering in his name. The myths he leveraged to guarantee his own survival have trapped him. He is now locked into a predetermined, catastrophic trajectory driven by the very people he sought to lead. Paul Atreides replaced the Imperium's reliance on brute force with the far more durable power of shared belief. But in choosing to wear the mask of a god to save his life, he unleashed a destructive force that neither he nor the universe can control.
Look at this landscape. Endless, sun-baked sand dunes stretched across an entirely isolated world. Surviving here requires an extraordinary level of physical and mental endurance. The Harkonnens attempt to rule this brutal environment the only way they know how. They rely entirely on conventional power structures, hoarding institutional wealth, deploying massive armies, and ruling the local population through absolute fear. But that model has a fatal flaw. Military force drains physical resources, and intimidation eventually stops working on an oppressed population that has absolutely nothing left to lose. To permanently break a supreme military machine, an oppressed people need a weapon that conventional armies cannot shoot, starve, or outspend. They need an unshakable collective belief. Long before Paul Atreides ever sets foot in the sand, the groundwork for that belief is already laid. The Bene Gesserit order utilizes a covert system of psychological manipulation known as the Missionaria Protectiva. A single source infiltrates a culture, seeding local tribes with specific prophecies over multiple generations. These planted concepts build a rigid psychological framework, leaving an empty space at the center for a savior. This intense religious fervor is the result of calculated social engineering, a pre-programmed cultural response waiting for an actor to step on stage and play the part. When Paul Atreides survives his escape into the deep desert, he inadvertently activates the specific prophecies embedded within the Fremen culture. To integrate into the wary Fremen culture, Paul needs a local identity. He decides to adopt a Fremen name. He chooses Muad'Dib. He simply admires this small, fragile creature for its adaptability and survival skills in a hostile environment, completely unaware of the mythological weight the word carries. This deeply personal choice of identity accidentally aligns with the exact requirements of the dormant prophecies. Word of Paul's tactical achievements quickly spreads from tribe to tribe. Through the lens of their religious expectations, the Fremen immediately reinterpret his very human displays of courage and combat skill as divine miracles. This chart shows how a myth is manufactured. Spiritual expectation feeds into political and military success, creating a self-sustaining cycle. Each victory validates the prophecy, breeding fanatical loyalty among his troops, which makes his next military victory even easier to achieve. The loop accelerates. Paul and his mother Jessica face a profound internal conflict. They fully recognize these prophecies are fabricated lies left behind by the Bene Gesserit, yet they actively choose to manipulate this faith to ensure their own survival. Meanwhile, the Harkonnens remain entirely blind to their impending doom. They continue counting troop numbers and guarding spice silos, missing the invisible cultural shift happening right beneath them. As the storytelling overrides the reality of the individual, this shared narrative transforms from a religious expectation into a source of revolutionary solidarity. As the legend grows, Paul, the individual, begins to disappear. His followers look at him and no longer see a human being with limitations, fears, or uncertainties. The symbol of Muad'Dib successfully binds the previously scattered Fremen tribes together. They merge into a single, monolithic revolutionary force with a unified purpose. But an army motivated by absolute conviction rather than simple obligation is highly susceptible to fanaticism. Intense devotion easily spirals into violent extremism. By becoming the ultimate symbol of liberation for his people, the leader himself becomes a prisoner to their collective expectations. This takes a massive psychological toll on Paul. Through his prescient visions, he sees the horrific endpoint of the legend he helped construct. He witnesses a terrifying future, a violent, galaxy-spanning religious war spreading uncontrollably in his name, consuming entire worlds in a tide of fanatical violence. This tragedy anchors author Frank Herbert's core warning:
Societies risk profound destruction when they surrender their critical thinking and place excessive faith in charismatic individuals. Engineering a myth can successfully overthrow an empire, but once that symbol takes on a life of its own, even the person who created it is powerless to stop the devastation it will unleash.
To the citizens across millions of worlds, Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV is a distant, untouchable sovereign. He sits at the top of the known universe, commanding a military apparatus so massive that its mere existence is usually enough to maintain order. He prefers to operate from the shadows. When he decided to eliminate Duke Leto Atreides, he funded and supplied the Harkonnens in secret. He orchestrated the destruction of a rival house while publicly maintaining a posture of total neutrality. This makes it all the more striking when Shaddam leaves the fortified safety of his throne room. He summons his royal court and his elite guards to travel physically to the most hostile rock in the galaxy, the desert planet Arrakis. A royal procession is a calculated display of supremacy, a ruler bringing his legions to a troubled region to project strength. But looking closely at the timing of this specific journey reveals an undercurrent of panic. Frank Herbert uses this arrival to explore a specific psychological reality. Those at the top of a hierarchy are often consumed by insecurity. Shaddam is not acting out of confidence, he is acting out of fear. By landing on Arrakis, Shaddam abandons his carefully maintained distance. To the noble houses watching from afar, the Emperor's physical presence signals that the situation in the spice fields is no longer something he can manage from the safety of his throne. That creeping paranoia is exactly what triggered the conflict to begin with. Shaddam targeted Duke Leto out of a preemptive fear of the Duke's rising charisma. He saw a potential rival and struck before that threat could mature. Shaddam rules by maintaining a delicate balance of noble houses and corporate interests. If they unite, his reign ends. Keeping them satisfied relies on one absolute bottleneck: Arrakis and the spice trade. Without a reliable flow of it, the entire political order collapses. When reports reach the Emperor that Harkonnen control is slipping and spice production is being disrupted, he is forced to act. He travels to Arrakis in a desperate scramble to save the imperial economy. Shaddam descends his ship's ramp as a hostage to his own economic system. He is entirely dependent on the very machinery he supposedly commands. When he touches down, he unloads his Sardaukar, the elite terror troops of the Imperium. He assumes he can throw enough elite bodies at the problem to crush the local rebellion and secure the spice fields. The Emperor shares the same fatal cognitive blind spot as the Harkonnens. They measure strength using the metrics they know: the size of a treasury, the number of ships in orbit, and the armor on their soldiers. Because of that worldview, they look at the native Fremen and see scattered, primitive nomads. They calculate that desert tribes simply lack the resources to matter in a galactic war. The Imperial commanders are entirely wrong. The Fremen have mastered the harshest environment in the universe, possessing tactical advantages that generals cannot comprehend. And now, those fighters are completely unified. They are rallying behind Paul Atreides, driven by an intense religious conviction in his destiny as their Messiah. The Emperor and his generals lack the conceptual framework to even recognize this emerging strength. By the time they realize the Fremen are a unified force, the old metrics of power will already be irrelevant. Paul Atreides sees the entire board. Thanks to his developing prescient visions, he knows exactly what the Emperor's arrival means. The forces that wiped out his family have conveniently gathered themselves in a single location. Yet Paul is not celebrating. Having foresight means carrying the psychological weight of knowing the extreme consequences of your actions. Paul understands a dynamic the Emperor is blind to. He knows that religious conviction is a vastly more potent weapon than standard military doctrine, and once unleashed, it is almost impossible to control. He sees the branching paths ahead. If he takes his revenge and destroys the Imperial forces, that victory could ignite a religious crusade that burns across the entire galaxy in his name. The clash on Arrakis pits the rigid, fear-based structures of the Imperium against an adaptable, decentralized force they cannot even name. Shaddam brought his armies to the deep desert expecting to secure his reign. By placing himself exactly where Paul's visions required,
the Emperor provided the catalyst needed to bury his own political order forever.
The Emperor has arrived on Arrakis, bringing elite Sardaukar troops and Harkonnen resources, casting long shadows as they mass against the Fremen. By every conventional metric of war, wealth, noble titles, and raw troop numbers, Paul Atreides and his localized desert uprising are facing total annihilation. Yet as these forces assemble, Paul isn't panicking. He is treating this immense pressure as an exercise in quiet, strategic planning, calmly reflecting on the board before him. He has a hidden advantage, but it isn't a magical guarantee of victory. This diagram represents Paul's expanding prescience, a single timeline that suddenly splinters into complex, branching pathways. But as these paths turn a flashing red, the curse becomes clear. Microscopic choices trigger massive, catastrophic outcomes. Defeating the Imperial forces is a relatively straightforward tactical equation. Paul's true challenge is figuring out how to win without becoming the catalyst for an unstoppable, fanatical galactic apocalypse. The Emperor and the Harkonnens share a glaring strategic blind spot. They rely absolutely on the established, traditional rules of Imperial warfare, equating authority entirely with wealth and standing armies. Paul flips this dynamic by weaponizing Arrakis itself. He recognizes that successful leadership requires adapting to local realities rather than abstract military theories, turning a violently tearing sandstorm into a calculated tactical asset. He pairs this environment with the Fremen warriors. Years of survival in extreme, punishing conditions have forged them into a force with extraordinary toughness and discipline, capable of moving and adapting in ways foreign troops simply cannot replicate. To coordinate this, Paul relies on his mother, Jessica. As a Bene Gesserit advisor, her insight into politics and psychology helps him channel this raw fighting force with intelligent timing, rather than just relying on their sheer courage. The Emperor's army is severely compromised before the fighting even starts. Deeply entrenched institutions inevitably fail when they cannot adapt to a completely new model of power. Paul didn't instantly inherit this desert army. He evolved alongside the Fremen, proving his competence through shared survival until basic tribal trust grew into absolute devotion. He is now the legend of Maud Deeb, casting a massive, distorted shadow over the population. An army driven by genuine belief provides a level of unity that rulers relying on fear or coercion can never replicate. But legends easily slip out of control. As the Fremen begin to view Paul as more than human, their fierce loyalty morphs into the early, dangerous stages of religious fanaticism. Looking at this timeline web, a thick, oppressive red color begins to infect and consume almost every path. This directly visualizes Paul's ultimate nightmare: billions of fanatical soldiers spreading across the galaxy, waging a bloody jihad in his name. This inflicts immense psychological torment on him. He must constantly evaluate how every single tactical military decision he makes pushes him closer to this inescapable, bloody future. His actual goal in preparing for this confrontation is terrifyingly precise. He is agonizingly trying to thread a needle, searching for the one sequence of events that liberates the Fremen while minimizing galactic suffering, arriving at an isolated, stable endpoint. Paul's greatest weapon, the messianic devotion of his followers, is simultaneously the very trap that threatens to destroy his morality and consume the universe. The sheltered, reactive heir who fled into the desert is gone. Paul has completed his transition into the proactive architect of galactic history. Because they blindly rely on outdated assumptions of authority, the institutions of the old empire have already been mentally and strategically defeated before a single blow is struck. Frank Herbert delivers a clear thesis here. True power is not a privilege to be enjoyed. It is a terrifying obligation, forming heavy, binding chains where every decision carries the weight of countless lives. Paul enters the final battle without the simplistic heroism typical of many leaders. He possesses the rare emotional maturity to know that victory won't fix everything. It will only create newer, far more complex problems. He stands ready for the final confrontation as the absolute master of his enemies, yet permanently trapped, bound by the crushing expectations of his followers, and staring into the devastating weight of the future he foresaw.
For generations, the rulers of Arrakis maintained their grip on the planet using a simple formula: vast wealth, advanced technology, and elite military forces. The Emperor and the Harkonnens assumed that whoever controlled the best weapons and the deepest pockets controlled the spice. Because of that reliance on conventional might, they completely misread the native Fremen population. The ruling powers dismissed them as scattered, unorganized desert tribes, a minor nuisance that could easily be kept in check through military superiority and routine intimidation. That assumption shatters in Section 40 of Dune. A highly disciplined, heavily armed resistance erupts from the dunes, launching a massive, perfectly coordinated ambush that completely blindsides the Imperial forces. Which leaves us with a fascinating logistical problem. How exactly does a marginalized society outmaneuver the most heavily resourced military in the known universe? The answer lies in how we define strength. The Empire measured their dominance in raw troop counts and weapon stockpiles, which blinded them to a type of power based on environmental adaptation and cultural unity. This sudden assault forces a total re-evaluation of military supremacy. It shows that a society's deep, hidden adaptations to a harsh environment can be more lethal than the most advanced imperial technology. The first of these unconventional metrics is cultural resilience. To survive in one of the harshest environments ever imagined, the Fremen had to endure decades of extreme, daily hardship. That constant pressure acted as an evolutionary crucible, forging a society composed of elite fighters. Every aspect of Fremen life requires absolute precision. Strict water conservation, mandatory community cooperation, and total self-discipline are basic requirements for staying alive. On a battlefield, these same traits function as military assets. The imperial military relies on a rigid, top-down hierarchy dependent on fragile supply chains, but the Fremen operate as an interconnected web. As Paul Atreides steps into leadership, he organizes this raw cultural discipline, pointing their collective energy toward a specific goal. The ruling powers thought they were keeping the Fremen suppressed. In reality, their oppression, combined with the brutal planet itself, had inadvertently built a highly unified, self-sustaining army that the Empire failed to recognize until the first strike landed. This deep connection extends directly to the battlefield. The Emperor's forces arrive to fight on the surface of Arrakis, constantly battling against the elements. The Fremen, however, fight with the planet. They possess an intimate, weaponized knowledge of the local environment. By mapping out specific weather patterns and exploiting treacherous terrain features, they execute strikes that outsiders lack the basic ecological knowledge to predict. The ultimate display of this environmental integration happens right at the start of the assault, when the Fremen deploy colossal sandworms directly into combat. For the Imperial forces, these creatures are unpredictable natural hazards to be avoided at all costs. For the Fremen, they are an integral part of desert life, and when properly harnessed, they function as unstoppable heavy cavalry. By adapting to the specific dangers of their home world, the Fremen managed to turn the harshest planet in the universe into a tactical weapon, one that conventional off-world technology cannot defeat. There is one final psychological metric of power driving this offensive. Over time, a deep-rooted religious belief has permeated Fremen society, the conviction that Paul Atreides is a prophetic figure destined to transform the universe. This belief shifts the stakes of the conflict. The assault is a sacred mission, generating a level of commitment and sacrifice that no paid army could match. Yet Paul experiences profound dread regarding this victory. His prescient abilities show him a future where this religious fervor fuels violent, uncontrollable campaigns across the galaxy. Herbert builds this religious dimension with a specific duality. While faith provides the unity needed for victory, the text links this devotion to future fanaticism. It suggests that the same commitment required to win a revolution can eventually become a force of mass destruction. This shared faith creates a unifying engine that no imperial budget could buy, but it also acts as a spark,
threatening to ignite a crusade that could consume the galaxy long after the battle is won. In the immediate aftermath of this initial assault, the momentum shifts decisively. The Harkonnen and Imperial forces are shattered, their long-held confidence replaced by uncertainty. For the Fremen, this marks a shift in their collective identity. They transition from a defensive people, merely trying to survive under foreign rule, to a proactive force claiming their own self-determination. The events of Section 40 show that when an ignored population finally recognizes its own collective strength and acts in unison, the existing political order loses its ability to control their destiny.
In Frank Herbert's science fiction epic Dune, the story's military climax converges on a single confrontation, the Battle of Arrakeen. The city of Arrakeen serves as the administrative heart of planet Arrakis. Years earlier, it was the site of a betrayal that destroyed House Atreides. Now, whoever controls this city controls the mechanisms of planetary governance and the valuable spice trade. The occupying forces rely on two models of power. House Harkonnen maintains control through wealth and fear. Meanwhile, the Emperor commands authority built on formal titles, hierarchy, and the reputation of his elite Sardaukar soldiers. For generations, the Imperium has treated this structure as permanent. They believe their rule is secure because they have only ever fought enemies who operate within their established political framework. But this perceived invincibility holds up only as long as everyone plays by those rules. But when a rigid superpower faces an unpredictable enemy that operates entirely outside of that system, the entire structure is violently tested. Led by Paul Atreides, the native Fremen launch an assault that discards conventional tactics by weaponizing the planet itself. They ride giant sandworms directly into the Imperial lines. This creates immediate psychological shock. To the Emperor's forces, sandworms are natural hazards to be avoided. Seeing them controlled and deployed in combat shatters the troops' assumptions of what is possible on the battlefield. The Emperor's Sardaukar were originally forged on the harsh prison world of Seleucia Secundus. However, after years of dominance, they have become reliant on their institutional reputation rather than continuous adaptation. The Fremen were shaped by the even deadlier conditions of Arrakis. Rather than fighting against the desert, they incorporated it into their culture, becoming warriors that the imperial system is unprepared to face. This clash demonstrates that military strength is not an inherent trait granted by a state. It is a product of environmental adaptation and the ability to survive under extreme conditions. Paul Atreides coordinates the battle while serving as a focal point of inspiration for his forces. He is a commander whose presence motivates the individuals executing his strategy. This stands in contrast to his opponents. The Harkonnens depend on top-down intimidation and wealth to force their troops into action, creating a command structure that is reactive and brittle. The Fremen strike with a momentum driven by genuine conviction. Many warriors enter the battle viewing Paul as a messianic figure, transforming a military operation into a mission of destiny. Yet Paul's ability to see the future makes him aware of the danger in this devotion. He understands that religious fervor is a double-edged sword that he may not be able to control once it is unleashed. Despite those risks, the results on the battlefield are clear. A force united by shared belief possesses a resilience that coercion and fear cannot replicate. The battle ends the old galactic order. Defeating the Imperial and Harkonnen forces signals the previous era is over. The Emperor's trust in titles and reliance on intimidation proved fragile. Their institutions couldn't respond to enemies rejecting their authority. A third model of power emerges from the battle, one built on deep cultural cohesion, complete mastery of their environment, and a unified sense of purpose. Arrakeen proves that true power cannot be bought with wealth or inherited through a title. It cannot be maintained through fear alone once a population finds a cause to believe in. Ultimately, true authority belongs to those who truly understand their environment, adapt to its changes, and inspire collective action. The outcome at Arrakeen marks the moment the galaxy was forced to accept this new reality. In Frank Herbert's Dune, the narrative builds for hundreds of pages towards Section 42. After years of exile and preparation,
Paul Atreides finally stands before the man who orchestrated his family's destruction, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Herbert avoids the traditional beats of a revenge story. While Paul seeks justice for his father, he has grown beyond a simple desire for personal vengeance. This scene functions as a study of political authority. It stages a direct collision between opposing visions of leadership and human destiny. To understand the stakes, we have to look at the Baron's position at the start of the novel. He is protected by immense wealth, political influence, and a secret pact with Emperor Shaddam IV that allowed him to dismantle House Atreides from the shadows. This chart represents his worldview. Power belongs to those willing to manipulate others, treating people as disposable tools. He believes he can maintain control indefinitely through fear. But this arrogance blinds him to threats outside his expectations, leaving him vulnerable to a resistance beneath the surface. While the Baron relied on established systems of exploitation, Paul was transformed by the deep desert. The survival disciplines of the Fremen turned the young nobleman into Muad'Dib, a leader capable of challenging the Imperium itself. This life among the Fremen provided Paul with a perspective wealth cannot buy. By the time he reaches the Baron, he is no longer the vulnerable youth his enemy continues to underestimate. Herbert uses this shift to define legitimate leadership. In this universe, legitimacy is not a product of inherited titles or the raw military strength the Harkonnens rely on. Paul realizes that true authority requires an understanding of those being led. He accepts that leadership affects countless lives, and that power must be exercised with a constant awareness of consequence. The Baron measures success through personal gain and influence. Paul's growing authority is tethered to his responsibility to the Fremen and the future of the planet. This encounter resolves a feud that has defined two noble houses for generations. It brings the established aristocratic order of the Harkonnens into a final conflict with a transformative movement rooted in cultural identity. Historical forces converge here. The Baron thrived within a system of tradition and memory, but those same structures are beginning to collapse as the political landscape shifts. If we look at the mechanics of the Baron's power, his reliance on manipulation created his own blind spots. He became trapped by the assumption that his control was absolute. He dismissed Paul's survival, underestimated the Fremen's strength, and ignored his cruelty's consequences. This diagram shows the inherent instability of his methods. Coercion undermines loyalty and creates hidden enemies. When the circumstances on Arrakis changed, the structures supporting the Baron proved weaker than he imagined. His downfall results from his inability to recognize his own limitations. The very qualities he used to achieve power, his ruthlessness and arrogance, eventually ensured his defeat. The death of Baron Harkonnen marks the immediate collapse of his regime. The architect of the Atreides' destruction is gone, and the balance of power on Arrakis shifts decisively. This is a form of poetic justice. The man who believed he could control every variable was ultimately destroyed by the forces he refused to take seriously. The Baron's removal shatters the established system of aristocratic manipulation and economic exploitation that House Harkonnen represented. Because their rule was the linchpin of the planet's output, his death triggers a collapse of the old political order. This outcome supports Herbert's observation that power sustained solely through intimidation is inherently unstable. When the source of fear is removed, the entire system built upon it evaporates. However, victory does not guarantee a better future. For Paul, defeating the man who killed his father is only the beginning of a much more difficult journey. He now faces the paradox of the victor. Eliminating an enemy is a matter of strategy and violence, but governing a society requires navigating a web of new and complex responsibilities. Military success creates fresh dangers. Paul understands that his new authority over the Fremen brings with it a set of political and social risks that he cannot easily control. His prescient visions continue to warn him of a future shaped by fanaticism and violence. This awareness distinguishes Paul from a traditional hero. He sees that his victory might spark a fire he cannot put out.
Section 42 represents a transition into a new, uncertain era. Paul moves closer to ultimate power, but he does so with the heavy knowledge that every achievement carries a new and inescapable burden.
Even the most stable-looking political systems can possess hidden internal fractures. When a government relies entirely on the perception that it cannot be defeated, it can collapse overnight once that image is challenged. In Frank Herbert's Dune, Emperor Shaddam IV rules as a distant figure of absolute authority. His power rests on the Sardaukar, an elite military force whose reputation for brutality has kept the galaxy in a state of obedient terror for centuries. We can think of the Imperium as a hub-and-spoke model. The Emperor sits at the center, controlling the great houses. But those houses are only locked into place by this outer ring, the constant threat of a Sardaukar intervention. This creates a rigid but brittle system. It functions perfectly until that outer ring of perception is tested, and the military threat loses its psychological weight. An empire built on fear rather than genuine loyalty is profoundly vulnerable. If the central myth of the ruler's strength is ever cracked, the institutions supporting him have no other reason to remain standing. When the emperor arrives on Arrakis, he believes he is conducting a simple police action to restore stability. He views the Fremen as primitive desert dwellers. This arrogance blinds him to their actual sophistication, coordination, and the revolutionary movement growing beneath the surface of the planet. Author Frank Herbert used this specific oversight to critique how powerful, entrenched institutions often become trapped by their own assumptions. Shaddam expects to fight a disorganized insurgency, but he instead encounters an army led by Paul Atreides, a leader who has mastered a way of life and a method of warfare that the Emperor doesn't even recognize as a threat. Powerful institutions often fail when they lose the capacity to recognize unconventional risks, remaining focused on the rules of the old world while a new one is being built right in front of them. To understand the collapse, we have to look at the difference between hard military power and legitimacy, the public's belief that the system is actually just. Paul's first strike is information-based. He exposes the Emperor's secret role in the illegal destruction of House Atreides. This revelation shatters the Emperor's moral standing. It reveals that the head of the legal system is a corrupt manipulator who ignores his own laws for personal advantage. Once the moral foundation of a ruler is exposed as a fraud, the psychological basis for obedience evaporates. Formal laws become meaningless if the person enforcing them is seen as the primary lawbreaker. Next, the military myth is dismantled. The Sardaukar were forged on the prison world of Salusa Secundus, while the Fremen were shaped by the unforgiving environment of Arrakis. Both environments produce elite warriors, but their underlying societal structures create different results on the battlefield. The Sardaukar form a rigid, top-down pyramid of authoritarian conditioning. The Fremen function as a decentralized web of nodes, held together by shared traditions. In direct confrontation, the Fremen's adaptability overwhelms the rigid imperial hierarchy, causing a total collapse of the Sardaukar lines. When the Fremen rout the supposedly invincible Imperial Guard, the psychological anchor of the throne is gone. The great houses suddenly see that the Emperor's primary deterrent can be defeated in open combat. The outcome suggests that cultural cohesion and a shared sense of purpose can provide a resilience that traditional military training alone cannot replicate. The final blow is economic. Paul secures absolute control over the production of the spice melange. Spice is the single bottleneck for all interstellar travel. Without it, the great houses cannot move their goods or their armies. Herbert used this to show that military titles and political hierarchies are secondary to controlling the fundamental resources that allow a society to function. Political authority is essentially a hollow shell if it loses access to the economic engines that sustain its power. The emperor is deposed, but Paul finds that victory brings its own set of problems. He stands as the new, undisputed ruler, yet he cannot celebrate. His prescient visions reveal a horrific future. The very revolution he led to overthrow a dictator is now evolving into something he can no longer contain.
he sees an uncontrollable religious crusade spreading across the galaxy in his name, replacing the old order with a new, more devastating form of violence. Overthrowing a system is often easier than managing the chaos that follows. Political change might end one set of injustices, but it inherently creates a landscape of new, unpredictable dangers. Shaddam represented an order that relied on tradition and rigid control. Paul represents a new paradigm, synthesizing noble training, Fremen culture, and an understanding of the forces shaping the future. The collapse of the old empire forces everyone in the galaxy to reconsider their assumptions about how power is held and how quickly it can be lost. Ultimately, the fall of the throne proves that power belongs to those who can master the shifting pillars of legitimacy and economics. But as Paul discovers, being able to see the future doesn't always give you the power to stop it. Paul Atreides has achieved the impossible. He united the Fremen forces, shattered the Emperor's Sardaukar legions, and dismantled the political systems upholding House Harkonnen. With the Emperor kneeling in submission, Paul holds every military advantage. He controls the spice, and by extension, the entire universe. He could simply order the execution of his remaining enemies. Instead of issuing that order, Paul accepts a formal, life-or-death, hand-to-hand knife fight from Fade Routha Harkonnen. Curious, a conqueror with the power to level cities and the prescience to see through time chooses a scenario where a single slip on the floor could erase his entire empire. Why risk the future on a blade? Because dominating an enemy army leaves a political victory incomplete. To truly secure his rule, Paul must physically overcome the universe's mirror image of himself. The immediate answer lies in the traditions of the Imperium. This is a society built on honor and formal ritual. Even with a defeated enemy, refusing a direct challenge from a rival house would damage a new ruler's legitimacy in the eyes of the other great houses. Fade Routha is a distinct, immediate threat. Unlike his uncle, Baron Harkonnen, Fade possesses youth, intelligence, and lethal physical skill. His ambition remains sharp, even as his family's empire collapses around him. Both young men share identical starting conditions: noble birth, exceptional abilities, and powerful external grooming. But their environments pulled them in opposite directions. Paul's path was forged through Fremen discipline and responsibility. Conversely, Fade was raised in a predatory environment, driven by corruption and ambition. When they draw their blades, it becomes a test of ideology. It pits the burden of guiding a collective future against the drive to advance the self. Beneath the politics, there is a hidden biological layer to the stool. Both men are active participants in the Bene Gesserit breeding program. For centuries, this secretive sisterhood has operated with a singular objective: shaping human evolution through calculated genetic planning. Fade Routha was a vital variable in this system. He was the intended outcome of generations of genetic math. Paul is an unplanned variable, born from a mother's defiance, a son instead of a daughter. The fight on the throne room floor is the literal physical collision of these two competing genetic tracks. This duel demonstrates that while the sisterhood can track genetic potential through centuries of records, they cannot predict the friction of two human wills in a room. The math provides the potential. The knife decides the reality. Paul does not enter this ring with arrogance. His prescience forces him into caution, reminding him that victory is never guaranteed. He knows that no matter how favorable the position appears, the future is still unwritten. Across from him, Fade plays a symbolic role. He represents the violent refusal of established, corrupt systems to die quietly. Their claims to power offer a contrast. Fade relies on a public image of heroism and charisma. Paul has been hardened by the deep desert, trading his noble birthright for the survival skills of a Fremen leader. This duel strips away the optics and tests performance against character. Frank Herbert constructed this climax to make a point about agency. He forces vast historical currents and prophecies to halt, making them bow to the reality of individual human choice. He demonstrates that even in a universe defined by genetic math and future sight, a personal decision at the micro level can rewrite destiny. By stepping into the ring and surviving the mirror test of his own dark potential, Paul severs the chains of the old universe. he proves his readiness to carry the terrifying weight of what comes next. The Fremen are united. The Emperor's forces are crushed. Paul Atreides has decisively won the massive battle for the desert planet Arrakis. Yet, for a war fought on a sweeping planetary scale, the entire conflict violently bottlenecks down into a single room, two men circling each other with poisoned blades. On the surface, this looks like a classic, satisfying resolution. The victorious hero finally gets to drive a knife into the villain whose family murdered his father and destroyed his life. That treating this as a simple revenge fantasy completely misses Frank Herbert's intent for the entire novel. Physical combat, personal destiny, and historical forces violently intersect in this single moment, turning the duel into a final test of everything Paul has learned. Stepping into the ring, we see two apex combatants shaped by years of intense, specialized preparation. Feyd-Rautha is a genuinely lethal threat. He possesses deep charisma, physical courage, and a formidable skill set that makes him entirely capable of winning. Because they are both so highly trained, the physical choreography of their fight becomes a direct reflection of their opposing moral and political philosophies. This diagram maps their opposing tactical approaches. On one side, Feyd's methodology relies heavily on deception, hidden tricks, and raw ambition. Paul's counter-strategy neutralizes Feyd through supreme awareness and adaptability, skills forged by Bene Gesserit discipline and hardened by desert survival. Paul's victory over Feyd's traditional tactics signals that the old political rules of the Imperium no longer apply. But the true tension of this duel happens in the internal, psychological space of Paul's mind. He possesses terrifying prescient abilities. His mind is constantly visualizing multiple, branching futures, calculating entirely different outcomes, all happening simultaneously. Knowing the future, however, provides zero physical protection against a knife thrust right now. His survival hinges entirely on decisive, immediate physical action. His extraordinary foresight cannot save him if he lacks the traditional combat discipline needed to dodge the blade. To survive the next few seconds, Paul must simultaneously utilize his father's combat lessons, his Fremen survival instincts, and his Messiah-like foresight. The fight forces these separate roles to finally act as one. Destiny is never a passive guarantee in Herbert's universe. It has to be violently seized through present-moment courage. Paul prevails, Feyd-Rautha is killed, and the Harkonnen threat to House Atreides is permanently extinguished. The audience observing the corpse, the Emperor, the Bene Gesserit, the Fremen, all silently realize the old political order has definitively died on that floor. Yet the victory feels incredibly hollow. A dead Harkonnen does nothing to erase the trauma of the past or resurrect Duke Leto. By removing this final obstacle, Paul is forced to fully claim the mantle of Muad'Dib and absolute authority. Achieving total power officially opens the door to the devastating, uncontrollable galactic holy war he saw in his visions. The final duel forces a rethink of the happy ending. Herbert leaves us with a victory that brings only a heavier, more terrifying weight of leadership. A displaced prince survives the wilderness, rallies an underdog army, and overthrows a corrupt empire to reclaim his birthright. It is the exact, satisfying payoff we expect from a heroic epic. This identical sequence plays out when Paul Atreides shatters House Harkonnen and humbles Emperor Shaddam IV to seize control of the desert planet Arrakis. The universe stands in awe, yet the victor himself feels no triumph. Instead of celebrating, Paul is cautious, heavily burdened, and filled with a creeping dread. The author, Frank Herbert, deliberately structured this climax to frustrate our expectations. He takes this standard heroic narrative and violently twists it into something deeply unsettling. Why does the total defeat of his enemies and the acquisition of supreme authority feel like a tragedy for the protagonist? Herbert built a political trap disguised as a victory lap. By taking the imperial throne, Paul Atreides has essentially locked himself inside a prison of his own making. For centuries, the old imperial system seemed permanent. Emperor Shaddam believed his throne was untouchable, backed by the sheer military force of his Sardaukar legions and the momentum of ancient institutional tradition. That stability was an illusion. Paul dismantled this structure by assembling a four-part formula for legitimacy that rapidly tips the balance of power.
The first advantage is his bloodline. As the son of Duke Leto Atreides, Paul holds the noble credentials required to demand an audience with the great houses. The second is raw strength. By cornering the Emperor and defeating the Sardaukar in open combat, he removes his rival's physical ability to resist. The third is an absolute economic monopoly. Paul controls Arrakis, meaning he alone commands the flow of spice, the single resource required for all interstellar navigation and commerce. The fourth and most potent factor is social. He commands the absolute religious devotion of the Fremen people. Fusing political, military, economic, and religious authority allows Paul to bypass traditional defenses entirely. He outmaneuvers the Empire in a matter of hours, but the resulting power base proves impossible to safely control. Because Paul utilized local prophecies to unite his forces, the Fremen do not see him as a brilliant tactician. They worship him as the Messiah, Muad'Dib. His prescient visions repeatedly show the result of this worship, his fanatical followers surging across the galaxy, launching an uncontrollable intergalactic crusade. This is the crux of his dilemma. Paul holds absolute authority, yet he lacks the ability to dictate how his millions of followers will interpret his commands or weaponize his image. This total loss of agency extends deep into his personal life, completely inverting the expectation that the victor gets to choose his own path. To legally bind the old regime to his new empire and stabilize the transition, Paul is forced to marry the emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan. It is a purely transactional alliance, requiring him to sideline Chani, his actual Fremen partner and the woman he loves, to secure the throne. Ascending to the highest seat of power did not grant him freedom. It stripped away his free will, forcing him to subordinate his own humanity to keep the machinery of the empire running. Marginalized desert tribes now dictate politics across the stars. The great houses and the Bene Gesserit, who spent generations manipulating bloodlines, are suddenly rendered irrelevant. To achieve this, Paul has traded away the innocence of his youth and his personal ambitions, inheriting instead a crushing burden of infinite, inescapable consequences. The text practically demands that we express extreme skepticism toward charismatic leaders and messianic figures, no matter how righteous their initial cause appears. Total military victories rarely tie up loose ends cleanly. Instead, they give birth to new, unpredictable challenges, driven by whoever holds the newly concentrated power. Section 46 does not mark a happy conclusion. It is the ominous opening sequence of a far more dangerous reality. Paul Atreides successfully conquered the universe, outsmarting every rival on the board. But by stepping onto the throne, he ensured that the game of absolute power is now going to play him. Science fiction often follows a predictable arc. The empire falls, the hero ascends, and we assume peace follows. Frank Herbert's Dune provides exactly this setup. Paul Atreides survives the desert, defeats Emperor Shaddam IV, and claims the imperial throne. Yet the final pages lack any sense of triumph. The mood is one of profound, suffocating anxiety. Frank Herbert refused to offer a clean resolution. He chose to leave his characters and his readers buried under the weight of unresolved crises. Herbert moves past the mechanics of the revolution to examine the terrifying obligations that begin the moment the fighting stops. Throughout the book, Paul's ability to see possible futures, his prescience, is treated by others like a supreme gift. For him, it functions as a paralyzing trap. He sees decades of brutal consequences attached to every single choice he makes. This illustrates his persistent vision, a galactic holy war. From Arrakis, a fanatical movement expands outwards, bringing mass destruction in his name. He cannot stop it. To the Fremen, he's an infallible deity. That devotion has locked the galaxy onto a violent path. When a society places absolute, uncritical faith in a charismatic leader, it will eagerly justify unimaginable destruction. Elevating a savior leaves a population vulnerable, stripping away the critical thinking necessary to question authority. Meanwhile, the immediate physical conflict is over. Paul sits on the throne. For the Fremen, this triggers an abrupt shift. They spent generations surviving as marginalized nomads fighting a guerrilla war.
Overnight, they have become the dominant military and institutional authority in the universe. This diagram maps out the existing power structures they now manage, factions like the Bene Gesserit and Great Houses. They form a centuries-old political machine maintaining a specific equilibrium. Swapping emperors doesn't dissolve social hierarchies. The underlying machinery remains, actively resisting top-down control. Tearing down an empire requires vision and force. Running one requires compromise and bureaucracy. The revolutionaries suddenly find themselves struggling to manage the exact systems they just fought to defeat. The Fremen also bring a deeply rooted dream to their new empire, a multi-generational plan to terraform their brutal, arid homeworld into a lush, green paradise. For centuries, this was just a distant fantasy. But with Paul's vast resources and supreme authority, they finally have the practical means to execute this massive environmental project. There's a massive catch. The desert ecosystem produces the spice. If you green the planet, you kill the organism that creates the resource. Without spice, safe interstellar travel stops. The entire galactic economy and transportation network would instantly collapse. Fulfilling their oldest dream triggers a systemic collapse as the ecological change chokes out the spice production required for the universe to function. By the final pages of the novel, Paul Atreides stands at the peak of his power, yet he is entirely boxed in by the momentum of his own success. To secure his throne, he is forced into a political marriage with Princess Irulan, even though his true, private loyalty remains with his Fremen partner, Chani. Public duty completely overrides his personal freedom. History does not pause for a happy ending. Defeating your enemies and claiming the prize simply trades one set of immediate problems for a new, often more volatile set of responsibilities. The text leaves us with a clear warning. Remain skeptical of simple narratives about chosen ones. True responsibility involves recognizing that every victory creates new ripples of consequence. The future is built on the shifting, heavy weight of human choices.
Paul Atreides starts his journey as an untested noble. Betrayed by his enemies and left for dead, he survives the punishing deserts of Arrakis, adapts to a hostile environment, and eventually rises to defeat the Emperor. By seizing the throne, he becomes Muad'Dib. He is now the single most powerful individual in the known universe, commanding total authority over every existing planet. But Frank Herbert's Dune doesn't stop at the victory parade. The real story begins after the throne is won. The narrative shifts to the terrifying weight of absolute power, and what actually happens when one person attempts to steer the fate of a galaxy. By tearing down old political structures, Paul sets off a chain reaction. The forces he unleashes grow too vast to contain. To understand his legacy, we must examine the three cascading ripples of his victory. Trailing his good intentions is a wake of unintended destruction. Look at the Fremen before Paul's arrival. Imperial society pushed them to the margins, dismissing them as primitive desert dwellers, completely blind to their deep cultural sophistication. Paul unites these scattered tribes into a potent military force. Under his command, the Fremen topple galactic institutions, seizing political influence and total control over their own future. Yet this victory triggers an immediate crisis of identity. Everything that defines the Fremen, their severe discipline, their traditions, and their social structure, was forged entirely as a survival mechanism in a brutal, water-starved environment. Herbert leaves us with a difficult question. As the Fremen move from the punishing deep desert to the comfortable halls of power, will they lose the exact qualities that made them strong to begin with? Their political success comes at a steep cost. By finally gaining control over their destiny, the Fremen risk eroding the cultural identity that kept them alive for generations. For centuries, the Fremen held a singular ambition: to terraform the punishing sands of Arrakis into a lush, green, hospitable world. Paul's victory means this ecological vision can finally become a reality. It appears to be a significant triumph of human engineering over a hostile environment. This flowchart shows the deeply interconnected ecosystem of Arrakis. The harsh desert produces spice, the universe's most necessary resource. Replacing the desert with vegetation breaks that cycle entirely. Greening the planet wipes out spice production, paralyzing interstellar travel and crashing the galactic economy.
This ecological ripple proves that noble intentions are insufficient when dealing with complex systems. Try to fix one localized problem, and you can easily jeopardize an entire interstellar network. Politically, Paul's ascension shatters the balance of power. By defeating the emperor and sidelining the great houses, he creates a total vacuum that forces every traditional institution to adapt to his new rules. But his most devoted followers don't see him as a shrewd politician or military tactician. To them, he is the literal fulfillment of divine prophecy. This kind of projection strips away his humanity. Under the weight of absolute worship, Paul ceases to be a flawed, complex person. He is flattened into a perfect, infallible symbol. Symbols can be weaponized. That absolute belief inspires terrifying devotion, triggering a violent, uncontrollable galactic jihad fought by limitless legions, all in his name. The creation of myth is a natural human impulse, but a lethal one. Once a leader is elevated to a deity, they lose control over their own narrative. Followers will use the legend to justify atrocities the leader never intended. Despite his incredible prescient visions and absolute authority, Paul Atreides ends up trapped. He is caught between reality and memory, essentially becoming a prisoner of the myth he helped create. History has a habit of simplifying complex figures. Future generations will remember the idealized legend of Muad'Dib, completely erasing the human doubts, fears, and desperate compromises of the man himself. This is Herbert's core warning to the reader. Societies have to understand the very human weaknesses of their leaders. If we simply worship the myths built around them, we surrender our own ability to see reality clearly. Because power and responsibility are permanently linked. Even with the ability to see the future, no single individual, no matter how capable, can completely control the cascading forces they set in motion. Muad'Dib's lasting significance goes beyond the borders of his empire or the scale of his victories. He represents the reality that the unintended consequences of absolute power inevitably outlive the leader who wields it.
60 years after its publication, the scale of Dune's influence remains massive. On the surface, the story follows a familiar arc of triumph. Paul Atreides unites the desert-dwelling Fremen, defeats his imperial enemies, and secures total control over spice, the most valuable resource in existence. Paul is the perfect embodiment of the mythological savior. He arrives as a highly intelligent, courageous, and capable leader, the exact kind of hero societies have historically sought out to solve their most desperate and complex problems. But Frank Herbert intentionally framed this ultimate victory as a looming tragedy. He refused to give the reader a simple, happy ending, choosing instead to use Paul's success as a vehicle for a much darker warning. Concentrating unlimited authority in a single person creates a catastrophic point of failure. Even the most talented leaders are subject to human limitations and unintended consequences. When those individuals make a mistake, the scale of their power ensures the resulting ripple effects are devastating. The narrative serves as a cautionary tale against the illusion of control. It demonstrates that altering any part of a complex system will always trigger ripples that are impossible to manage or predict. We see this dynamic first in the environment of Arrakis. The planet is more than a setting. It is a character that dictates every facet of life. This hostile reality fuels the dream of transforming Arrakis into a green paradise. This terraforming concept represents a massive effort to engineer a better world. Herbert was ahead of his time in recognizing that such interventions are never simple. Every action taken to fix a natural system triggers unpredictable reactions across the wider ecosystem. Changing one variable often causes the entire balance to shift in ways the engineers never intended. Nature's complexity resists brute force control. Effective environmental stewardship requires humility and understanding that these systems are far more intricate than they appear on the surface. Solving one systemic problem through aggressive intervention mathematically guarantees the creation of new complications elsewhere.
The environment of Arrakis proves that humans must work with natural systems, rather than attempting to force them into a predetermined mold. This same pattern of unintended consequences applies to the social structure of the Fremen. Just as terraforming disrupts the desert, Paul's arrival disrupts their culture and their future. Paul leverages Fremen religious expectations to become Muad'Dib, a messianic figure. This gives him the power to unite a people and defeat his enemies, fueled by a scale of absolute devotion that few leaders ever achieve. But this devotion comes at a steep price. When a society views a leader as an infallible savior, individuals abandon their own critical thinking and personal responsibility. They stop questioning decisions, leaving the future of their civilization entirely in the hands of one person. The outcome of this unchecked faith is horrific. Paul's visions reveal that his name will become the banner for a galactic jihad, a bloody, uncontrollable conflict carried out by followers who no longer answer to any logic but his own. This highlights a central paradox in human history. The shared faith required to inspire great unity and courage is the exact same energy that fuels fanaticism and mass destruction. The final system the novel explores is time itself. Paul succeeds where his enemies fail because he is adaptable. While the Emperor and the Harkonnens rely on rigid, outdated institutions, Paul remains flexible and willing to learn from new cultures. He navigates the future using prescience, the ability to see possible outcomes before they happen. In the story, this serves as a metaphor for the human desire for perfect planning and prediction. This branching timeline shows that even with literal foresight, Paul cannot eliminate risk. Knowing what might happen does not grant him absolute control over the outcome. Humans naturally seek certainty, but this graphic illustrates the uncertainty inherent in every choice. Herbert insists that no matter how much information we have, reality often resists our efforts to predict it. Survival is not achieved through perfect prediction or rigid control. It requires continuous adaptability and the resilience to act responsibly despite never having complete information. Dune continues to challenge readers because it refuses to provide easy answers. It suggests that our greatest challenges cannot be solved with simple slogans or charismatic figures. Herbert believed that history is shaped by ongoing human choices rather than predetermined destinies or the arrival of a perfect hero. Relying on a single leader's brilliance gradually erodes a society's ability to think for itself. When collective wisdom is abandoned in favor of unquestioning obedience, the community becomes as fragile as the human being at its center. Real stability requires us to constantly question conventional assumptions. Success belongs to those who look beneath the surface and examine the deeper connections between politics, ecology, and belief. The work provides a timeless exploration of the forces shaping our world. It challenges us to navigate complexity through the difficult, necessary work of constant and critical awareness.